Good morning. I'm John Fortier, the American Enterprise Institute. I am here at this point very briefly to welcome you all to AEI, and to really encourage you to listen to this work of a group that I've been a part of, but not the leader of, for a little while, a year and a half or so, of some very serious study of electoral reform in a number of ways. A group of election lawyers, election scholars in the political science community have come together and produced this. And I'm going to put this up here because, of course, Christmas is coming and stocking stuffers are needed. And it is Electoral Reform in the United States, Proposals for Combating Polarization and Extremism. And you'll see the three leaders of our effort, the three chief authors and editors of this book, although there are other authors as well, are Larry Diamond of Stanford University and the Hoover Institution, Ned Foley of the Ohio State Lawrence College of Law, and Rick Pildes of New York University Law School. So with that, I'm going to welcome Rick Pildes up to talk more substantively about the book, and we'll have a day where we'll talk, but we'll also involve you in the questions as well. Plug the book.
This is our only copy at the moment. So I was asked to give some opening remarks to kind of set the stage for the project that culminated in the book. I do want to first thank AEI for hosting this event. We're very grateful to be able to make use of your beautiful space here at 1789 Mass Ave. I did learn last night the corruption involved in getting the address changed to 1789. So I applaud you for that. So let me start by saying we all know that the vast majority of Americans are not satisfied with the way American democracy is currently working. A recent Gallup poll showed about 15% approval for Congress. If you think Congress has always had these terrible ratings, that's not true. You don't even have to go back to some golden age in the 19th century. In the 90s and the early 2000s, about 40 to 50% of people approved Congress's performance. In a 2021 Pew survey, a stunning 85% of Americans said the US political system needs major changes or must be completely reformed. And there are good reasons for this dissatisfaction. Congress increasingly seems unable to address effectively the major issues of the day that citizens care most urgently about. The most recent congressional session that's about to end was the least productive since at least the Great Depression era. In the 1970s, Congress enacted legislation on the major issues people identified as the most important issues about 60 to 70% of the time. Now it's down to about 30% of the time. There's a bit of a silver lining in all of this because members of Congress dislike the institution just as much as the rest of Americans. It's very easy to find statements. I collected a few here, if I can find them quickly, from members of Congress who say they see the institution the same as most Americans. People feel no loyalty to this institution. This is a member of the House. Right now, Washington, D.C. is broken. It's hard to get anything done. Again, a member of Congress. Senator Tillis of North Carolina, attention grabbing has become part of a business model for people here. They're doing it for purposes of exposure or money. If there's a long-term goal in mind, boy, I'd sure like them to reveal it. We also know that one of the major reasons the political system has become so incapable of delivering is the rise of the hyperpolarized political parties that have come to characterize our era. And in our complex system of bicameralism, separation of powers, a Senate filibuster, bipartisan deals are necessary for most major pieces of legislation. Now, a second factor in the dysfunction of Congress that I think is less well appreciated compared to polarization is the way the parties are internally fragmented as well. So we have polarized parties, but also parties that are kind of riven with factions. Particularly, this has been most pronounced in recent years on the Republican side, and the strongest evidence of this is the way the party has kind of consumed one of its own speakers of the House after another, going back to John Boehner. So even during periods of unified government, it's been very difficult to get this system to deliver effectively on major issues. And we'll see now how the new unified Republican government for the next 2 years, at least, manages to navigate these tensions within the party. How much do they deliver effectively on the issues that they claim to want to address? But in addition to the dysfunction of the formal kind of political institutions, we also know our political culture more generally has become increasingly toxic and tribalistic. We've seen the rise of what political scientists call affective polarization, or what I call emotional polarization, meaning that people now view people on the other side with intense hostility, much more as kind of enemies than mere political opponents. And this is particularly striking because we still see lots of studies suggesting the vast mass of the American public is less polarized and more moderate in its policy positions than partisan activists or members of Congress. These studies show that people, particularly partisans, believe that the other side has much more extreme views than it actually does. But we have been living through this era of polarized parties, tribalistic and toxic political culture. And I think we all know that and are all very concerned about it. So after the 2020 election, these concerns became all the more acute for some of us. And we decided to see if we could put together a task force of academic experts and others with expertise in the political process to study whether there are features of our institutional framework within which our politics takes place, within which our elections take place, that unduly empower the more extreme forces in our politics and make government more responsive to the ideological wings of the parties rather than to citizens more generally. How much of the hyperpolarization of the political parties and the inability of Congress to deliver is a function of the particular way we structure our political processes and electoral competition? How much do our structures encourage or empower, as I said, the more extreme forces rather than the more centrist forces in our politics? And when we decided to form this task force, Larry, Diamond, Ned, Foley, and myself, and reached out to academic experts and others, we were very gratified about the response we received. And we ended up with something like 31 political scientists, law professors, people with other kinds of expertise in politics working on this project that culminates in the book we're going to talk about today. We also found generous support from funders, and I want to mention them at the outset: the Arnold Ventures, the Skoll Foundation, the New York Law School Center on Democratic Governance, Erica Lawson, if it's okay to mention her by name. She's mentioned in the book, an individual funder. And here are the things that we kind of were committed to in pursuing this project. We wanted to bring to bear rigorous, current, empirical understandings of the various institutional design issues that we were going to examine. Too often, political reform discussion is based more on hope or maybe ideology than on real confrontation with the current state of empirical knowledge about how various reforms are likely to work or have worked or have failed to work. So we wanted to really ground this work in the current state of empirical understanding of these various institutional design issues. We didn't want to force an artificial consensus among our experts, and there are divisions on some of these views. You'll actually hear about some of those divisions this morning. And we wanted to focus on what we thought of as relatively practical institutional design measures, meaning things that either have been adopted in some states or one could imagine being adopted. In other words, we put to the side issues like the Electoral College or the structure of the Senate or anything like that. So those were the basic commitments. Now, we are all institutional design kind of experts, so we didn't address issues like the state of the media ecosystem and other things that bear on the nature of our current tribalistic and toxic political environment. We focused on institutional structures. And in the end, we focused on these issues, which you'll hear about today. One is possible changes to the structure of primary elections. A second is possible changes to the voting rules that we use, the ways we determine what it means to win an election, how votes are aggregated or how votes are put together to determine a winner of the election. The possibility of moving to proportional representation for the House. Possible changes to the presidential nominations process, possible changes to the primary debate process in the presidential election context. And ultimately, the kind of governance we get is directly related to the institutional frameworks within which political competition takes place. The framework of elections creates incentives for certain kinds of candidates to run or not to run. It rewards certain kinds of candidates rather than others. And all of these things create incentives for how people behave in government and how they govern. Since all of them look with at least one eye towards the next election. And so if there's broad dissatisfaction with the kind of governance we're getting, it's critical that we look at the institutional structures that create those who govern and ask if the politics we get or are getting is an accurate reflection of who we are or is distorted by the particular institutional structures that we currently use. So that's what motivated this book. We're very grateful to the Lynn Reiner Publishing Company for getting this put together so quickly. The task force worked over, I don't know exactly how long, but a couple of years to produce this effort. So we're very grateful that all of you are here to listen to the results as we talk about them. And with that, I think we can move to our first panel.
Rob's going to get Rob. Okay. Where's Rob? There he is. There's Rob.
Trying to steal my water. I tried to. Poison it.
Welcome again. Where is it? We're here today to celebrate the culmination of a lot of work in this book, Electoral Reform in the United States, Proposals for Combating Polarization and Extremism. As Rick mentioned, there are a number of different subgroups of this effort, a number of different chapters, and a number of different topics, and we're going to talk about some of them today. We're going to hear from all these people, but we're also going to hear from you some questions. And I want to put one other thing out there for those of you watching online, that you can send in questions. One would be to email Jaehun Lee, that's jaehun.lee@aei.org, or with the hashtag AI Reform. Am I right about that? Yes, the hashtag AI Reform. So we're going to begin with Ned Foley, who's going to make a presentation, and then we're going to go down the line, not directly down the line, but we're going to hear from everybody with a little back and forth, but then talk amongst ourselves. So why don't we begin with Ned? Ned does have a PowerPoint presentation, but you're going to do it from your seat.
Yeah, if this works, because I can see it, and hopefully you all can see it as well. So I'm talking about Chapter 2. There's a lot in Chapter 2. So I'm only going to talk about the portion of it that I think would be most useful to discuss this morning. And that portion comes from work that was done by some colleagues of ours, which I'm citing here. So Nate Atkinson, Scott Gans, and John Mantis have done 100,000 computer simulations of different electoral systems applied to different electorates with the goal to try to figure out To what degree do these different electoral procedures of the kind that Rick was referring to can deal with the problem of polarization and extremism and achieve results that we might call more centripetal, centripetal meaning coming towards the center, as opposed to polarized going apart. So the first thing that they did was they created model electorates. These are abstracted from the real world to test out the different systems. So this first electorate is a 50-50 down the middle purple electorate. Half are blue, half are red, but because of low polarization, the voters are clumped together towards the middle. It looks like a traditional bell curve, if you can see the slide. And that's contrasted with a highly polarized 50-50 electorate. So here, the difference between these two is the second district or statewide electorate is also exactly 50-50, half red, half blue, but the voters are dispersed and create what's called this bimodal distribution as opposed to the bell curve. So we collectively then apply different electoral systems to these electorates to see what results you get when you run 100,000 computer simulations. And the first result is our traditional conventional electoral system. So these are partisan primaries as the first stage of the process, followed by the so-called plurality winner general election, where you just need to win more votes than your opponent, doesn't need to be a majority. And what you see, this is now the distribution of the 100,000 winners in that electorate using that system, and it's clumped pretty close to the center, right? You get these 2 points, but they're quite close to the center. This is the proverbial notion of politics being played within the 40-yard lines when polarization is low. On the other hand, and by the way, the assumption here about the nature of the primaries, this is an important point, is that the Democratic Party primary electorate mirrors the blue half of the overall electorate. The turnout might be lower, but in terms of the profile of the electorate, it's one half of the side of the spectrum. Republican primary is the other half of the spectrum. If you relax that assumption and you assume that voters in the primaries are themselves more polarized and skewed than the corresponding half of the overall electorate, then the polarization of the winners becomes even greater. But we hold that assumptions for reasons that we'll talk about in a minute. All right, so same electoral system, same assumption, but now we go to the highly polarized 50-50 electorate. And you see immediately the difference in the results of the elections, right? You're getting winners on both sides, left and right, but more extreme in terms of the partisan and ideological nature of the winners. They're further towards the end of the spectrum, less close to the winners. Some political scientists call this leapfrog representation. Given our plurality system, winners oscillate back and forth quite far from the median in a 50-50 state or district like this. All right, so then let's look at other electoral systems given these electorates. And the first one that we wanted to study is the new Alaska system, which many people may be familiar with by now. This is a nonpartisan primary in which 4 candidates move on to the general election, and the winner is chosen by ranked choice voting or a particular form of ranked choice voting called instant runoff voting. That instant runoff procedure eliminates the candidate with the fewest first place votes and redistributes the ballots to whoever is ranked second on the ballot. And by the way, Alaska just reapproved, barely, but reapproved the use of this system going forward. So when you apply that system to the low polarization 50-50 district, you see you get winners a lot close to the center, right? There are now more winners right at the 50-yard line, so to speak. And so this is an important finding, that the nature of this system is going to tend to depolarize, meaning more centripetal effect in an electorate of this nature. By the way, I'm just looking this morning at the 50-50 districts or electorates. The chapter in its appendix has the same type of analysis for districts and states that lean very far to the right or very far to the left as well, because those also come in either low polarization flavors or high polarization flavors. But what the next slide will show you is that this same Alaska system applied to the highly polarized 50-50 electorate yields a very different result. Here, the winners are dispersed, and they're essentially as dispersed to the same extent as under the conventional plurality winner system. And again, this is assuming that in the nonpartisan primary, you've got all the voters, again, regardless of turnout, the voters are a fair cross-section of the electorate as a whole. You're still getting dispersed winners. But you can vary the Alaska system in one detail, and that's to use something called a Condorcet tabulation procedure for the ranked ballots. Condorcet was this French mathematician who said that in his view, the fairest way to elect a single winner from a field of candidates is to identify the candidate who is a majority of voters preferred as against each other candidate one-on-one or head-to-head. And so you can construct that kind of election off of ranked ballots, because for every pair of candidates on each ballot, one is going to be ranked higher, the other is going to be ranked lower. And so you can do all of those head-to-head comparisons and identify the Condorcet winner. And when you do that, and so if you just apply that tabulation method, the voters rank their ballots the same, the nonpartisan primary is the same, 4 candidates move on to the general election, you get winners that are, again, closer to the center. There's still going to be some dispersion because it's a highly polarized electorate, but more of a centripetal effect. And the centripetal effect of each electoral system can be quantified numerically as well as shown visually in these graphs. And that's done through a formula that we developed called the centripetal force, or C-force formula. And I'll just kind of walk you through this. It's pretty simple. You can see this on the slide. It's 1 minus W over V. What are these numbers? V is the average distribution of the voters compared to the median voter of the electorate. So each voter on that curve, whether it's the bell curve or the bimodal curve, has a measured distance from the median. And you sum up all those distances and you take the average, and that's your average distance of the voters from the median. And then you can do the same thing with the distribution of the winners of these 100,000 winners in the computer simulations. And so then the average distance of the winners from the median voter, because the median voter is the anchor of the analysis. Again, in a majority rule system, we're trying to find the candidate closest to the median voter. So if every winner was in the exact same spot as the median voter, W would be 0, and C-force would be a perfect score of 1. That would be as much centripetal effect that any electoral system could possibly have. By contrast, if the winners overall are no more dispersed or no less dispersed than the voters themselves, right? So the average distance of winners is the same as the average distance of voters, then the ratio is going to be 1, and C-force is going to be 0. So that's an electoral system that has neither any centripetal effect nor any effective, the opposite of exacerbating polarization. But if it turns out, this is kind of the point that Rick was alluding to, if the elected representatives in our system are more polarized than the voters themselves, so that W is greater than V, your electoral system is actually going to have a negative C-force number. It's going to exacerbate the problem of polarization, produce more extreme winners than the voters themselves are on average. And it turns out that when we relax that assumption about party primaries that I talked about before, that's exactly the effect that you get. In our current electoral system, if the voters in partisan primaries are themselves more polarized than general electorate voters, the C-force score of our existing system becomes negative, and we get that extra dispersion. But the C-force numbers for the ones that I showed you, based on the assumption that primary voters are no different than general election voters, we yield positive C-force scores. But notice here, the numbers confirm what we saw visually. If we look at the C-force score for the plurality winner system in the instant runoff version of the Alaska system, Alaska's own system, it's essentially identical, numbers. It's only with the move to that so-called Condorcet variation on the Alaska system, then you get a significant centripetal effect from your electoral system. So we can then take this model analysis and actually apply it to the states that we all live in. And our colleagues did that as well. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of this. Nevada is one of our most polarized states. What Scott and his colleagues did is take the social science, as Rick said, we wanted to make this based on the best available empirical data that we could, and taking that data about the nature of voters in the state of Arizona, created a profile of the electorate. And Nevada being especially polarized, it has something of that bimodal distribution. It doesn't look like the perfect model district that we saw, but Nevada is one of those 50-50 states. So here we have a real-world 50-50 polarized electorate. And sure enough, when you apply the Alaska system as it exists to that electorate, you're going to get the dispersion of winners quite far from the median. On the other hand, if you use the Condorcet variation on that same system, you get winners much more clumped towards the center, much less polarized. Same thing true with Arizona, which is pretty similar to Nevada, so we don't need to repeat it, but this same story. Here's an example, Mississippi, of a state that's clearly not 50-50, leans very much to one side, but nonetheless is quite polarized in its electorate. And sure enough, what happens there is that regardless of what system you use, you're going to get the winners on the right side of the spectrum. But your winners are going to be further from the median under the instant runoff system compared to the Condorcet system. So here's Alaska. And what's interesting about Alaska itself is it turns out it's one of the least polarized electorates of all of our 50 states. I mean, it's not perfectly low polarization, but it doesn't have quite the bimodal distribution that we saw, say, with Arizona or Nevada. And sure enough, Alaska has picked a good system for itself. The instant runoff voting system does tend to produce winners that are less polarized. And we've seen that already. It's only been around for a few electoral cycles, but we've sort of seen it work in that way. You don't get as much divergence in results between the IRV tabulation method of the ballots versus the Condorcet tabulation method, which is the opposite of a state like Nevada or Arizona. Vermont, just as another example, is a very low polarized state, obviously leans to the left. Again, not that much divergence between these two variations. By the way, just briefly, one point. If you run a 4-candidate general election the way Alaska does, or if you did that in a Condorcet system, you would need to use ranked ballots to make it work efficiently. Just in a Condorcet system, you'd count the ranked ballots differently. If you actually, and this is discussed in the chapter, if you wanted to run an election without ranked ballots because of potential controversy there is with the idea of ranked choice voting, and we can talk about what happened this fall in terms of reform initiatives on the ballot. You can actually run a Condorcet election doing the direct head-to-head comparisons with 3 candidates where you wouldn't even need to use ranked ballots. But these slides assume the same kind of ranked ballot that Alaska uses. Anyway, I'm just about to wrap up here. We're not going to go through the number. The point is you can compute the C4 scores for each electoral system in each state, the way we did with the model districts. But what's really important about computing those numbers is when you take all 50 states and you plot it, this is what you see. So the horizontal axis here is the degree of polarization of the electorate in the state. This is the so-called V number, right? The average distance of voters from the median. And the greater that number is, the further to the right you are on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis is the C4 score for the Alaska IRV system in that state. And so what this plot is showing you is that as polarization of the state increases, the effectiveness of the Alaska system as an antidote to polarization decreases quite significantly.
Everybody's going to ask what that dot
That's DC. That's our, right here where we are, District of Columbia is the outlier. By contrast, again, here the horizontal axis is the same, how polarized the electorate is. Now the vertical axis is the C4 score for the Condorcet variation. There's still a diminution in its effectiveness in counteracting polarization as the electorate becomes more and more polarized, but the loss of effectiveness is much less. And when you put those two together and you just take the difference in C4 scores between these two systems, Condorcet and IRV, you see that dramatic increase in effectiveness in the Condorcet system in counteracting extremism and polarization relative to IRV as the electorate itself is more and more polarized. So with that, let's stop there.
Great. Now, you'll correct me. I think we're going to go to Lee, followed by Rick, and then to Rob Boatwright at the end. So I've introduced some of our leaders, but Lee Dretman, the America Foundation, and then followed by Rick Pildes.
And I'm going to set a 15-minute timer here so that I stay on time. All right. Oh, I don't want that. Hold on, sorry. Okay. Now we're going to start a 15-minute timer. All right. So I'm talking about proportional representation. And of the reforms in this volume, proportional representation is obviously the boldest, most transformative, although I think it's actually quite consistent with the American political tradition, including the Madisonian view of multiple factions, overlapping factions. But I want to start just by really explaining why I think proportional representation is what's needed. And why we need a bold reform is because we are in a really bad situation in our democracy. Now, at the beginning, Rick talked about how low satisfaction is with U.S. democracy. 83% of Americans don't think elected officials care about them. Only 19% of Americans think the U.S. democracy is a good model. 28% view both parties unfavorably now, which is up from 6% in 1994. And you look at this current election that we just went through, it's a huge rejection of the status quo. Tremendous anti-system views expressed in this election. Democrats said, we're the party of democracy, vote for us. A lot of voters said, democracy, I don't like how that's working in this country. Maybe I want a big change. Might be that in a two-party system, you are voting for change and you accidentally get authoritarianism. We're going to see about that. So if we understand the moment that we're in as product of political development that got us to this point, we have to think about the nationalization of our politics, geographical sorting, resentment that is rising as people see two parties fighting, calling each other names, and I don't feel represented in this party system increasingly. Talk about the hollowness of our political parties and the way that our party system and our electoral system has led to very weak and failing parties. And I think we also have to talk about what I've called the two-party doom loop, which is this escalating back and forth of increasingly extreme rhetoric, demonization. Your side is fascist, your side hates America, your side went after me in this January 6th committee, so all people in the January 6th committee should go to jail. I mean, this is just an escalating rhetoric, and it's a system problem, right? It's not something that you can tinker with on the margins. It's something where you have to address the core of the system, the core of the doom loop, and that is this two-party binary system. And sometimes I think we want to tinker on the margins. We want to give the patient an aspirin, calm down when the patient is having a heart attack, patient being our democracy, and we need like a major shock, a defibrillation of sorts. And we need to really get back to what made American democracy work, which is a complex multidimensionality. And you think about the nationalization of our politics is also a flattening of our politics. It's taking out the diversity that used to exist. Federalism used to give us quite a bit of diversity in our politics, made our politics multidimensional. We had something more like a four-party system: liberal Republicans, conservative Democrats, liberal Democrats, conservative Republicans. The nationalization of our politics, filtered through our single winner election two-party system, has just created this zero-sum binary. So I think of PR as perhaps the least radical solution that could actually work, that could actually bring us back to what we had. And the version that I like is an open list version that essentially combines the primary and the general election into one. I would like to see 5 to 7 member districts, probably ideally 4 to 6 parties. We'd also expand the House. There's a separate report that Yuval Levin and I and Norm Ornstein, who are at AEI but not in this room, put together with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, calling for an expanded House. And also, I think at the center of any of these reform conversations, we have to talk about the role of political parties. Political parties are the essential institutions of modern representative democracy. They are core intermediary institutions, and we have weak and hollow parties. So any reform effort that we're talking about needs to put parties front and center, and I think an open list party system does put political parties at the center. Now, there's a lot of scaremongering. Well, what would PR look like? Would it be like Israel or, Italy? Those are extreme cases. Nobody's proposing the Israeli system of PR, which is an extreme system where the entire country is one electoral district. We're limited by states, and I think we'd see depending on how we set the thresholds and how we design the system, and we could have some conversations of that, we'd be working with the existing presidential system, so you'd see pre-electoral coalitions. We'd be working with the existing Senate, so you wouldn't tend towards too much fractionalization, but I think a modest level of fractionalization. Right now we have an electoral system with single-member districts where 90% of congressional districts are not competitive. You could juice that a little bit with independent redistricting, but the geographical sorting of the parties makes it really hard to generate much competition there. You have a problem of gerrymandering, multi-member proportional representation, no gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is only possible with small magnitude districts, particularly single-member districts. Larger districts, you get away with gerrymandering. Every vote matters, competition everywhere. And you could govern Congress in the same way that multi-party legislatures around the world operate. Parties come together, they form operating coalitions, and they divvy up committee assignments. And frankly, that's a lot like how the US Congress worked in the past before we had these strong top-down parties, when the parties really were multi-party coalitions. In fact, there was a long period from about 1937 to 1961 when you essentially had a bipartisan coalition governing the U.S. Congress, strong committee system. Now, obviously some problems with that related to civil rights, but you had a more decentralized Congress up until the late 80s, and this is when a lot of people say, oh, we got to go back to regular order. I think this is what we would get. Now you could have presidents. This is what you see in presidential multi-party systems. Presidents have coalitions within their cabinet, and I mean, it's politics, right? There's horse trading, agreements last, then they fall apart, then you have new agreements. It's fluid coalitions. That's what makes politics healthy. Right now we have calcified politics where it's very hard to find new coalitions, even though there are compromises hiding in plain sight on a lot of issues. So in the chapter I talk about what do we know about how proportional representation would impact some of the core concerns that this volume was dealing with, particularly polarization, the affective, emotional polarization, and extremism. So been a lot of studies now on how effective polarization relates to the electoral system. And now this has been multiple studies. What we see is that in countries with more parties, more proportional electoral systems, there is less polarization. Less effective polarization, which we have to distinguish from ideological polarization. Effective polarization is the thing that makes democracy really hard, because when you really hate the other side, you're not willing to compromise with them, to give them the benefit of the doubt, to do the mutual tolerance and the forbearance that are essential to making democracy work. And there's a reason that effective polarization is less in multi-party systems, is because the coalitions are shifting. And there is what some political scientists have called an affective bonus, where if your party has been in a coalition with another party, you view that party warmly. Even if that coalition was in the past, you don't think of them as your permanent enemy. What we have in the US system is the same two parties fighting the same zero-sum trench warfare election after election, and that breeds an incredible level of resentment that turns into dehumanization and paves the way for violence. So you see more multidimensional issue politics in multi-party systems, more cross-cutting cleavages across race, education, geography, ethnicity, and this is a fundamental thing that political scientists know is essential for democratic stability, is cross-cutting multidimensional cleavages where not one fight defines everything. This is something the framers knew. They said, we can't have one fight that's just two factions against each other. We're going to wind up in civil war. Extremism, now, extremism, I view it as a property of the system. And when you have this binary zero-sum doom loop polarization, that breeds extremism. It's an escalation of political warfare. And it's also a lot of people in this country feeling like the system is broken. They don't feel represented, and they are willing to, say, give a middle finger to the entire system because they don't feel like it's working for them. And this is something that moderation can't solve, because a lot of people feel like it's not in the political center that the solutions lie. It's we need genuine transformation. Now, you're going to hear some skepticism from Rick Pildes. He and I have had some spirited arguments over the years, and I appreciate his skepticism. He's going to try to scare you about how Europe is so chaotic and it's falling apart. And what Rick sees as Europe falling apart, I see as realignment of a political system in a moment in which the cleavages are changing. Fundamental conflicts of politics are changing. And yes, there are extreme parties on the right, but the European parties on the right are, except for a few of them, are actually quite in line with what the US Republican Party is. In fact, the US Republican Party is more liberal and more anti-democratic than the French National Rally or some other parties. I think that is something that we have to wrestle with under Trump. So, I mean, the challenge of democracy is that we have to, manage inherent societal disagreement without violence. There's no silver bullet here, and all of these reforms have trade-offs. The question is how bold we want to go. I think there's, some of the things that I've heard that are skepticisms of PR is, well, how can you have effective government. There are PR countries around the world that have effective government. Again, the US, I mean, we have a two-party system, but really those two parties contain multitudes, and by being trapped in these same two coalitions, they are continually forced to unite around demonization of the other side, as opposed to allowing some of these coalitions inside the parties to readjust and realign and become more multidimensional. You might hear from Rick that, well, how are people going to know who their representatives are if they have multiple representatives? I give you the US Senate. People have multiple representatives, 2 senators and a House member. And in fact, in a lot of districts, people have a representative who they didn't vote for, they don't feel represents them, is of an opposing party. And even if they voted for them, think about multiple parties, you can have much more granular representation of ideology, of life experience, of race, of gender. And then there are a lot more people who feel like they have somebody who actually represents them, who they actually feel like cares about them. And in fact, I'll just flag an upcoming paper that Ann Meeker of Popbox and I have looking at how constituency service would work under multi-party, multi-member districts. And I think there are a lot of ways it could work. There are a lot of countries that do it. We're not proposing a closed list Israeli system where constituency service is bad, but any system with an open list where voters also vote for candidates, there's an incentive for members competing with each other to distinguish themselves and to serve different constituents. Now, is this too bold of a reform? Again, I think we're in a moment in which it's clear that the status quo is not working. The level of resentment, of dissatisfaction with how things are going in the US, it is really, really dangerous. This is a moment that demands big change, and I'd call attention to Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez and Jared Golden, just introduced a bill that would create a select committee on electoral reform. There's a number of members who are expressing some real interest. They know things aren't working here. MGP and Jared Golden in particular say, we need more members like us, because we're the people who represent not the extremes, but something different. And they understand how multi-party, multi-member districts could help them. I also want to take a quick moment to flag fusion voting, which is another multi-party, pro-party reform. Actually, while this is happening here in New Jersey, there's an appellate court hearing about whether the state ban on fusion should be overturned. Fusion is multiple parties being able to nominate the same candidates, a way for multiple parties to play. So bottom line here, democracy is a complex system. There's no silver bullet here. There's trade-offs, but I do think that we are in a significant moment of real democratic threat here. And I think we need to go bold to meet the moment. You don't give somebody an aspirin when they're having a heart attack, and you don't conduct more tests when somebody's having a heart attack. You bring in the defibrillator. All right, there it is.
All right, we will note that we are not providing official medical advice here, but I'm going to turn to
metaphorical medical advice.
Rick Pildes.
Yes. So as I mentioned at the outset, one of the things that we prize on this task force is the ability to actually have disagreements among ourselves on certain issues. And as Lee already sort of pre-butted, I am skeptical that this is a good idea. Just calling it bold 4 or 5 times doesn't mean it's something we ought to adopt. And a few other people in the task force signed a statement that I included in the book with my skepticism about Lee's proposal. And I have a much longer academic article in the Illinois Law Review, which kind of lays this out in more detail. So I'll try to make 3 points here about my skepticism about this proposal. The first is about the mechanics of implementing it. The second is that my view is the diagnosis of our situation that leads to this proposal is inaccurate or incorrect. And the third, and the most important, is I think the cure is worse than the disease. So let me just say a few things about implementation, because I think in these discussions, we don't often really work through the details of what implementing this kind of a change would mean. So just a few of the things it means is a 700-member House, roughly, as Lee says. He envisions like 5 or 6 parties in the House. That means 10 or more candidates running in multi-member congressional districts of about 2.4 million people, about 3 times the size of current congressional districts. We have to change how we would vote among these 10 or more candidates in these 2.5 million districts. Lee has suggested, as part of all this, a pretty radical proposal in terms of how Americans think about voting, an open list PR system. We have never voted on a party basis. We vote on a candidate basis. I might like that, by the way, but I think you should just understand the number of changes involved in trying to make this possible and envision in a concrete and practical way, what it would mean to have congressional districts like this and elections like this. And then, as Lee said, at the same time, you're still going to have the president elected under the constitutionally required system, the Senate elected under that system, which means we're certainly going to have the same kind of two-party dynamics at the level of the presidency and almost certainly at the level of the Senate that we currently do. So I even have a question about whether, even implementing all of these changes, we would actually get the multi-party Congress that Lee valorizes. Because with the presidency and the Senate, the most powerful offices being still dominated by the 2 major parties, that's going to create very powerful incentives for a lot of other actors in the system to stay within that 2-party structure. Now, you might say, well, that's the best thing that can be said from my perspective on behalf of Lee's proposal, that it wouldn't actually do what he wants it to do, because we would probably still have fundamentally a 2-party system given the presidency and the Senate. But that's on the implementation side, which I just think is important for people to really think through as you kind of wrestle with this proposal. The second point, Lee is convinced that the toxic tribalistic political culture I described at the beginning is a product of our first-past-the-post election system. And I am very skeptical about that diagnosis, because if you look at other first-past-the-post systems, you do not see the same kind of affective polarization, the same kind of tribalistic politics that we have. Take the UK, for example, the home of first-past-the-post. It's been the long history of the UK was described as a consensual, pragmatic sort of politics. But even today, it's still described, for all of the difficulties they're having, as this is Europe's haven of moderation by one political commentator, which I think is actually accurate if you compare it to what's happening on the continent. It still has a sort of moderate left of center, moderate right of center, 2 major political parties. Take Canada, nothing like the kind of affective polarization we have in the United States. So we all really dislike the kind of political culture we're in. We would all like there to be some silver bullet that would suddenly magically kind of transform that political culture. But to think that this particular election structure is the dominant force driving that seems to me not consistent with what we see in other first-past-the-post systems. There are a lot of other features of American politics that are very different from European politics that you have to think about here. First, for example, we have primary elections. Most democracies do not use primary elections to choose their nominees for office. And we've already talked a little bit about how primaries can drive our politics to the extremes. We have privately financed elections. One of the things we know about our individual donors, as Ray will talk about later, is they're much more ideological than voters are, or than citizens more generally are. And that's true of large donors. It's, I think, particularly true of small donors. And again, this is a unique feature of American politics. European democracies have public financing for their elections predominantly. The history of race in the United States and how it affects our politics is obviously a very, very significant factor that's distinct in the United States. So I'm just skeptical, as much as I would like there to be this magic silver bullet and the defibrillator, that this diagnosis is correct about what accounts predominantly for our current circumstances. But then my third point, which is to me the most important, I think the cure is worse than the disease here. So in my view, the major challenge democracies throughout the West are facing in this era is the inability to deliver effective government, or at least the perception among large portions of their citizenry that they're unable to deliver effective government. And I think and we probably agree on this, and I think this is an extremely dangerous point for democracies to be at, because when lots of people perceive them as failing to deliver, it can lead to, at a minimum, withdrawal or alienation and the like, distrust. But it can also lead to much more dangerous forces, including, the desire for strong men or strong women figures who will cut through all this dysfunction and, make things work at last. And I think this is the big challenge that democracies are facing right now. And I think if you look at how the multi-party systems of Europe have the closest democracies to us in terms of political culture, if you look at how they have worked over the last 10 years or so, they are in terrible shape. The image you might have of how PR has functioned in Europe, which many of us had, based on how it functioned for many, many decades until this last period of time, is very different from how these systems have been functioning over the last 10 to 15 years. And the fundamental difference is even the systems that were formally proportional representation functioned actually, in fact, as 2.5-party systems from World War II until this last 10 to 15 years. There was a center-right and a center-left party. They either had enough of a majority to govern or a smaller third party made up of a governing majority. So in a place like Germany, up until the last decade or so, the two major parties, the Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, got 90% of the vote between them, okay? All of this has profoundly changed over the last 10 to 15 years. And for the first time, really, these parties are, in fact, the multi-party, 5 or 6 party, not even 5 or 6, 3 or 4 party systems that Lee is envisioning. And they have become incredibly dysfunctional. And this is true throughout Europe, but look at Germany and France, okay? Germany, for the first time, has been governed by a 3-party coalition. It is an incoherent 3-party coalition, as multiple party systems often are, because in addition to the Social Democrats, it has the Green Party and the what they're called the Free Democrats, which is basically a much more free market, libertarian kind of party. They are constantly bickering with each other. They're unable to deliver, for the most part. It's the most unpopular government in Europe. The approval rating is like 19% of the government. It has collapsed. They have to go to new elections. And no one thinks Germany is in good shape politically or in other ways that politics affects. Look at France. France it's not actually formally a PR system, but it is become a multi-party system, and it's considered ungovernable now. It is ungovernable. It has a coalition of parties on the left. It has the Macron kind of centrist or center-right bloc. And then it has the new right, if you will, Marine Le Pen's party. And again, it is literally ungovernable. They cannot pass a budget. They had to go to new elections. That hasn't worked. They're going to probably have to go to new elections again when they can. They can't for a while. And this is true in country after country in Western Europe or Scandinavia over the last 10 to 15 years. Whether you look at Spain, Portugal, Austria, the Netherlands, Sweden, you have governments that take far, far longer to form because they have to form with these very big coalitions of multiple parties. The coalitions, as I said, are often kind of incoherent, which makes the development of policy very difficult. They are much more fragile. They lose votes of no confidence more frequently. They have to go to new elections repeatedly. Spain had, I think, something like 4 or 5 elections in a 4 or 5 year period from like 2015 to 2019. We're seeing this in Germany and France now. I don't know how anybody can look seriously at how multi-party government is working in Europe now and say, we want that. Now, again, I used to be sort of supportive of the German-style mixed member proportional system, or at least agnostic. But I think you have to not have the image in your head of how these systems worked 15 or 20 years ago and really come to terms with what's been going on over the last 15 years or so. Because I think the ability to deliver effective governments is so critical to the legitimacy of democratic systems today, to their broad acceptance, I think putting together effective governance with 5 or 6 parties in the House, if we would actually get that, is going to make or would make the delivery of effective government even more difficult than it is under our current system. Each party will have its own set of interests electorally and politically. Each party will be calculating what its advantages are. So if you split the Democratic Party into a Green Party and a Socialist Party and a moderate Democratic Party, they're no longer, as much as there are internal factions within the parties, they still have some significant common interest and agenda electorally. When they're split into separate parties, each of those parties has its own rent-seeking demands it will make to be part of a coalition to put together a governing majority in the House. And so I think that there are very, very good reasons to be careful before jumping on something that's called bold, merely because it's called bold, or merely because we are frustrated with the nature of our political culture today or our political dynamics. So let me stop there.
Great. I'm going to turn to Rob Boatwright of Clark University in Worcester and also the National Institute for Civil Discourse.
Okay, thank you. Can you get the slides ready? Okay, great, thanks. All right, I'm speaking on behalf of a group of task force members. Hans Knoll, who's here today, Sunshine Hilligus, Ray LaRaja, who you'll hear from later, Seth Maskett, and Carolyn Tolbert. We took as our mission the question of what kinds of changes within the basic confines of the direct primary might reduce extremism and might seem feasible in the short term. What we didn't consider is whether we should continue to use primaries, and therefore I think you'll find what I have to say here a distinctly pro-party set of reforms, something that's maybe a little bit more modest in its goals and more short-term oriented than what you've heard about so far this morning. In other words, I think we're going to be guilty of giving the patient a couple aspirin and sending him home. One reason I think we've chosen this approach is that the members of our group are people who've studied primaries, people who've studied political parties, and therefore I think we prefer to leave some of the big picture arguments about proportional representation, things like that, to others. Also, however, I think we come at this from a position of skepticism about whether the American public would support major changes to the primary system. We've had the direct primary for over a century now in most American states. It's not clear when the alarm goes off to tell you that things are going wrong. That is, have the last 15 years been an aberration, or is this the way primaries were always going to go? If I could shamelessly plug my own research for a moment, I recently published a history of primary election reform efforts during the 20th century. In that book, I argued 3 things. First, most of the common ideas for reforming primaries have been implemented at some point in the past century, including things like changing who can vote, having open primaries versus closed or open to unenrolled, all that sort of stuff. States have gone back and forth about this for decades. Similarly, states have changed their ballot access rules, determining who can run in the primary many times. And states have also moved their primary dates around quite a bit. So a lot of changes have been attempted in kind of a piecemeal way. And for the most part, they have had modest results. They have not substantially changed primaries. Second, though, the American public likes primaries. One other lesson of the past century is that every time a state tries to do something dramatic with the primary, voters often push back, particularly when the reforms sound anti-democratic. Many voters have sort of this naive understanding of democracy, and for them, primaries just sound like the most democratic way to do things. And third, parties are resilient. Every time primary reform is implemented, parties adapt, often in ways that mitigate the effects of the reform or cause consequences that reformers did not anticipate. As we know in our chapter, though, most previous arguments for primary reform have been about something other than extremism. So this task force, I think, gives us a new opportunity to look at problems that primaries create and to think creatively about what we might do. As we see it, there are three main goals that we might establish if we want to try to reduce extremism through changing primaries. We could try to increase participation in primaries. We could try to change the selection mechanism, kind of along the lines of what Ned has spoken about, or we could try to encourage more responsible political parties. Let's take these one by one. First, let's talk about turnout. Voter participation in primaries is extremely low. In the average election cycle, voter participation in the primary runs below 20% of the eligible electorate. This means a few things. It means that the people who vote in primaries are highly unrepresentative of the population. And the other, I think, more consequential thing is when turnout is this low, it means that a smallish increase in turnout does not necessarily make the electorate more representative. You can think about it like this. In a general election, if turnout goes from, say, 50 to 60%, the electorate almost necessarily becomes more democratic, where you're pulling in more marginal voters. On the other hand, if you have some sort of primary reform effort that drives turnout up from, say, 15 to 18%, which is the same magnitude of increase, you don't necessarily get a more representative electorate because that extra 3% of people who show up may be driven there by an extremist candidate. They may make the electorate less representative than the low turnout electorate was. We believe, we've not been able to prove this to our satisfaction, but this is what we think, that competition in primaries is largely driven by what's at the top of the ticket. That is, a Senate race or a gubernatorial primary can drive people to the polls. And the problem here is that you've got a lot of other folks running. You've got people running for Congress, you've got people running for the state legislature, and they're at the mercy of turnout dynamics that are simply beyond their control. They don't have a consistent primary electorate to run to, and therefore they can't figure out how to represent the population. So here are a few slides that illustrate this. You see here, this is primary turnout in midterm election years over roughly the past 80 or 90 years. This is a tremendous decline over time. And the other thing that you'll note here is that Republicans a few years back became a larger share of the primary electorate than Democrats. This is not because the electorate has shifted towards the Republicans. It is that the Republicans have had more competitive primaries over the past few years. It's simply more exciting to vote in a Republican primary. Here's another story. If you're around my age, you probably went to college at a time when all of your professors were lamenting this decline in general election turnout. In the 1990s, general election turnout briefly dropped below 50%, and this was seen as this national crisis. You see that line there at the bottom, that's primary turnout, which was dropping at the time and has just continued to drop, but we've not seen the sort of panic about primary turnout that we did about general election turnout. You see here we've got a bunch of examples of this in our chapter. The characteristics of the primary electorate, the main takeaway here, as you can see, is that primary voters are not representative of the population. All the people you'd think are overrepresented are older voters, white voters, people with conservative or liberal views as opposed to moderates, and so on. And you see here also, as you read across on the primaries on the right-hand side there, when primary turnout goes up it doesn't make the electorate more representative. You have wealthier people, for instance, becoming more overrepresented as primary turnout goes up. And finally, here you see state level turnout broken out by conservatives and liberals. So you see it bounces around in kind of a crazy way based on idiosyncratic things, which parties simply happen to have competitive primaries. So turnout is certainly a problem, and there are no easy solutions. I'll talk briefly about the selection mechanism. Ned has already covered much of this. What we know about the selection mechanism in primaries is that multi-candidate primaries in a first-past-the-post system will often yield plurality winners who don't represent the median voter. They don't have to, but they often do, again, in an idiosyncratic way, simply based on the number of competitive candidates who decide to run. We know that polarization can lead to partisan primary medians that are pretty far from the general electorate, even when you do only have a couple candidates in a primary, or even when you have uncompetitive primaries. One of the most common solutions to this is runoff elections, as have been used in 8 or 10 southern states. But these things don't necessarily improve things, because turnout in runoff elections is often quite low and is often quite different than what you saw in the initial race. What we don't know, though, is how often plurality winners change the way they campaign once they get to the general election, or how they behave in office. Here you have to be careful about making generalizations, because you're captive to particular anecdotes. You could tell me that, say, Marjorie Taylor Greene or other candidates won plurality primaries, therefore this is a sign that they discourage moderates. But there are plenty of other cases of veteran members of Congress. Tip O'Neill is perhaps the best example of this, who won competitive primaries with a small share of the vote and went on to, I think, adequately represent their district, went on to become normal legislators. So it's difficult to make generalizations there. All of this brings us to our third topic, the role of the parties. We know a bunch of things about parties historically. We know that strong parties tend to coalesce around their chosen nominees before primaries begin. They tend to ward off competition in this way. Certainly, this is one reason for the variation in turnout. Democrats have done a better job of choosing their nominees before primaries begin. And we know that party-allied super PACs largely perform this same function today. We know as well that there are tremendous variations by state. Some of the states that have historically been most skeptical of primaries are those that take tremendous steps to winnow the field before the primary happens. States like Connecticut and Virginia are examples of this. And we know that in countries where primaries are optional, Mexico is an example of this, that parties often use primaries strategically when it's in their interest to have a primary campaign. So it's entirely possible that if parties had more of an ability to structure primaries by selectively using ranked choice voting when it is in their interest, by reducing ballot access or endorsing candidates and so on, they might deter extremists. But the problem we run into here is that there we're making a gamble on the motivations of political parties. There is, to my knowledge, no good study that suggests that in some states parties will behave responsibly if given more ability to structure primaries, whereas in other states parties might behave less responsibly. But that's certainly the case. You can probably come up with plenty of examples of states where the state Democratic Party or the state Republican Party, in fact, is not representative of the average Democratic or Republican voter in those states. So it again winds up being kind of idiosyncratic. So what do we do with this? Well, our task force came up with 4 basic recommendations. One is to establish a single-day national primary. Primaries currently are spread out across 18 days over the course of the year, and this is, again, not even worrying about the effects of presidential primaries. We think that putting primaries on a single day would dramatically increase turnout. People would simply know when the primary is, and it would do so in a way that would pull in less engaged voters. If to take my home state of Massachusetts, if the primary in Massachusetts is boring, maybe I won't turn out. But if I hear stuff about a neighboring state, I get excited about primaries, maybe that makes me more likely to go. This would create a more consistent primary electorate. It would help candidates to campaign to a wider range of voters. Second, After long discussions about ranked choice voting that I'll get to in a moment, we decided that we think the best way to address the selection mechanism problem is by encouraging more experimentation. We're not sold on the Alaska model for reasons that I'll detail in a moment, but we see no harm in having more states try different kinds of reforms. We'll simply learn more about what works where and about different state dynamics. Third, we strongly support strengthening political parties, giving parties more of an ability to endorse before the primary, hold pre-primary conventions, changing campaign finance laws in ways that advantage the parties, allowing parties to be flexible about which primaries they're used, and so on. In our chapter, we have a long list of state constitutional provisions. In some states, giving parties more power is a matter of legislation or just having parties take initiative. In other states, it's a function of the state constitution and would require more effort. And we quarreled a lot, finally, about sore loser laws. Most American states prohibit candidates who've lost their primary from running again in the general election. Some members of our group thought that this deterred candidates with widespread bipartisan support from running. Others felt that this was an anti-party reform, that it weakened parties. So I kind of put this here, but I want to note that we're not in unanimity about it. So let me take a few moments, whatever time I have left then, to talk briefly about a couple things that came out of this apart from our recommendations. Let me talk a little bit about ranked choice voting. We don't yet feel that there's substantial evidence that ranked choice voting makes enough of a difference to justify the efforts that have gone into establishing it. It seems to me that it's worked relatively well in Alaska so far, but it's also taken millions of dollars in outside spending to keep this thing alive, right? To get it on the ballot in the first place, to preserve it in the past election cycle. We're not sure how sustainable this is, and we think there are effects down the road that we should be wary about. For one, I don't know that the Alaska primary will persist, because if you've got fewer than 4 people running, why bother to have a primary? I think this may ultimately lead towards states like Alaska abandoning their primaries altogether. It seems different, in addition, that we have to be careful about state dynamics. Alaska is a weird place in a lot of ways. They have an unusual party system. This is something that Ned showed you. They also have had coalition governments more often than not in their state legislature, which means that your vote in the primary doesn't matter, right? That the organization of the legislature is predetermined long before you vote. So we really need to find out how this works in other states, in sort of more conventional party states, before we can be sure that it works. In addition, we did a survey on public attitudes, and you'll see here that the public supports most primary reforms. The public also supports having primaries in general, right? That's the top thing, as opposed to getting rid of them. But ranked choice voting is the one thing where the parties are split. Whether you like it or not, Republicans have decided that ranked choice voting is a Democratic plot. And there's a lot of work, I think, to be done to convince Republicans that it's not. Otherwise, Democratic states may use this, Republican states won't. And I want to emphasize that this would not be the worst thing in the world. This is my home state of Massachusetts. We voted down a state-level initiative on ranked choice voting a few years ago. But I've pointed out here the 2 open seats we've had in the House over the past few years. In both cases, we had 9 or 10 candidate Democratic primaries where the winner came away with less than 25% of the vote. And in both of those races, the winners afterwards said, you know, maybe we should have used ranked choice voting. So it would be a tremendous thing to empower parties to use ranked choice voting in their primaries when it was in their interest. So those are our thoughts on ranked choice voting. Let me close with some comments on this National Primary Day concept. I've spent most of my career kind of telling people that their like cool ideas about election reform are not going to work. So as I kind of slide into middle age, I thought I'd come up with something to champion. And this is what I've come up with. I'm kind of getting ahead, I think, of the rest of the folks on my committee here. I think the nice thing about having a single day primary is, for one, it's not been attempted before. So while we can point to any number of reforms and say these things don't work, we haven't really tried consolidating primaries yet. It's the sort of thing that even if we only got a little bit of the way, if we encourage states to cluster their primaries a little bit more, I think this could have consequential effects. In addition to substantially, I think, driving up turnout, that is, instead of 15 to 18%, from like 15 to, I don't know, 40 or 50%, I think what you might see is a raft of sort of add-on effects. That is, the narrative that gets created by a successful primary challenge would go away, right? You'd have your primaries and then you're done. This would diminish the incentive for interest groups to selectively drop tens of millions of dollars into one or two primaries to make a point. And it would be something that could be like a civic event, right? Except that neither party would lose, right? Both parties would win. So I could go on like this a substantial amount, but this is kind of my pie in the sky idea about what we might do. Also, it's popular, right? Democrats and Republicans like the idea of having a single-day primary. So let me close then with a couple caveats. There are some people who think the establishment of the direct primary was a failure. We don't think that. We don't think primaries are the major cause of extremism either. People have a tendency to confuse things that happen in primaries with primaries. To take one example that I think we'll talk about later on today, it's clear that super PACs have begun to use primaries very selectively to knock out candidates they dislike. This is a problem, but it's a problem of the campaign finance system, not of the primary system. So we need to locate where the problems are. And I think finally there's a danger in overpromising. I think it's a real concern that if we motivate the electorate around one or two reforms that we say these things are going to change everything, and then we see mild results, we see things that don't necessarily upend the political system, this can demobilize the public, right? You could take a whole bunch of well-meaning reformers and you say, here's the thing to do, and then they look 10 years later and they're like, yeah, nothing changed. So we want to be cautious in the kinds of reforms that we advocate, but we think these are all things that could have consequences in the next decade or two that are likely to mildly improve our current political divisions.
Great. So I'm going to pose a question maybe down the line. I'd also then, after that, encourage a little bit of discussion amongst each other if some of you want to respond or question each other, and then we'll turn to the audience as well. The first question I have, and I think it applies mostly, maybe not as much to Rob, but I've got a separate thing for Rob, is just thinking about your proposals and what the end result you envision is, the number of the sort of number of parties or party system following this. I mean, I think Lee's proportional representation clearly envisions a multi-party system, maybe not the most number of parties, but certainly multi-party. Rick talked about 2.5 parties as being something he likes. A lot of people talk about it. I know what that means, I think, but I think maybe you'd want to explain maybe not a pure two-party system, but one that has a little bit of give. And on a Condorcet system or even ranked choice voting system, I think there's always this question, we get a final result, we get a majority winner and in one way. On the other hand, we perhaps create sort of several pots or several potential areas for multiple parties or factions to run. So if you were to implement these things, what would you see as the end result, and why would that be a good result of your reform?
Well, sure, I'll take a stab at this. First of all, I think Rob very helpfully talked about the most fundamental choice with respect to primaries is whether they retain the status of being party primaries, as historically been the case, or this concept of a nonpartisan primary is the term sometimes used for the Alaska system. California has it in its top 2 system, which is another electoral system that's in the chapter, but I didn't talk about it this morning. Some people don't like the term nonpartisan primary because if the word primary is associated with the traditional party primary, maybe we should call these all candidate preliminary elections or all candidate primaries. But the big feature there is whether the parties as an institution are gatekeepers. And there's been this debate within the 30 members of our task force about are reforms pro-party, anti-party, party neutral. If you think about the nonpartisan preliminary or first round of a 2-round system, it doesn't have to be anti-party. Parties can choose their own nominees in advance of the system, as Rob was saying. They could say, we only want so-and-so to be our candidate within the government system, but the government then runs a 2-stage system the way Alaska does, or the way France does, as Rick was talking about, And the dynamics of a two-round system are quite different from a single-round plurality winner system. Now, to John's point, for my mind, I think the best illustration of what the difference between a Condorcet two-round system versus the instant runoff two-round system that comes from my own state of Ohio. So let's take the US Senate election. And by the way, one of the reasons why my chapter focused on the issues that I did was, regardless of where you are on the debate on proportional representation, as Rick said, you cannot use PR for the US Senate. So if we're worried about the degree to which polarization and extremism has affected the US Senate as an institution, and on the governance point that Rick mentions, we've lost a lot of senators over the last decade who have been pro roll up your sleeves and get legislation done in a positive way for the American people. There's a lot more grandstanding, a lot more just polemical nature of the toxicity that Rick is talking about. So if we're worried about that on the Senate side, we've got to think, what reform will work. And the other thing that some of us are worried about the existing structure about primaries is the verb that we've all heard about being primaried. The threat of being primaried, it seems to me in my diagnosis, has been a significant factor in the behavior of the Senate. For example, on the impeachment issues, as we're looking into the nomination issues, I don't think as we think about extremism, polarization, how we govern, I think we really have to think about the way in which the current system of party primaries operates as an incentive to total party line. So if imagine Ohio had the kind of nonpartisan preliminary system that either California uses, Alaska uses, or could be used in a Condorcet system. The party in Ohio this year would have backed Bernie Moreno, the eventual winner. Right? He would win the partisan primary, or he would get the nomination as Trump's candidate, and he would go to the general election ballot because of the dominance of the Republican Party in Ohio. There was a guy named Matt Dolan who has now run twice as a more old-style Rob Portman from Ohio-style Republican, not identified with the MAGA wing, but definitely a Republican. He comes in second in the partisan primary, but doesn't get to the general election ballot, partly because of a sore loser law. But even if there wasn't a sore loser law in a plurality winner system, Matt Dolan has no chance in the general election, so why bother? If you use the Alaska system, it's a four-candidate system. There might be some fourth candidate, but ultimately the November race in Ohio would have been between Bernie Moreno, endorsed by Trump, Matt Dolan, the more non-MAGA Republican, and Sherrod Brown, the incumbent Democrat. And the instant runoff system would have caused Moreno to win, just like he wins under the plurality system, because Matt Dolan would get dropped out as having a lower number of first choice votes because, let's face it, MAGA is very prominent in Ohio. And the Democratic Party, while no longer dominant in Ohio for sure, still has significant clout. So Sherrod Brown and Bernie Moreno are going to duke it out in the instant runoff system, just like they'll duke it out in the plurality system. And you'll end up exactly where we are with a polarized result. Bernie Moreno, pretty polarized figure from my perspective. In the Condorcet system, you're saying those three candidates would all move on to the general election ballot. You'd have Bernie Moreno, Matt Dolan, and Sherrod Brown. And of course, we can't know exactly how this would work out because we haven't tried it yet, which is why I think the book as a whole values the idea of experimentation. Use the 50 states as laboratories of democracy and let's just see how different things might work. But there's at least a reason to think that the dynamics of a Condorcet election among those three candidates would operate differently, because the Condorcet process would be to have three different head-to-head matches. So you'd have Moreno versus Brown, which we already have, and we know the result about that. But then we'd have Matt Dolan versus Sherrod Brown. And in Ohio, which is a pretty red-leaning state, Matt Dolan is likely to beat Sherrod Brown for the same reason that Bernie Moreno did. Again, it's likely, we don't know for sure. And then the final matchup is Matt Dolan versus Bernie Moreno. And if Democrats in Ohio think, well, as between the two Republicans, we prefer the more moderate Matt Dolan to the Trump-endorsed Bernie Moreno, there's a chance that Matt Dolan beats Moreno in his head-to-head and beats Brown in his head-to-head and becomes the Condorcet winner. Now, what that does for the number of parties over time is you're likely to see a third, more centrist party become competitive in a Condorcet system in the way that it can't under either the plurality system or the instant runoff system. There seems to be a movement right now in the United States to try to get a centrist third party. Joe Manchin has talked about starting one. Liz Cheney has talked about starting one. Mitt Romney can't exist. No Labels wanted to do its thing. That movement is a non-starter in a plurality winner election. But you could have a new, and it's hard to do even with under fusion voting, frankly, Lee, we can talk about that. But a Condorcet system would be the kind of system that could genuinely make a third centrist party competitive and shake up the dynamics of our system.
All right, we'll put you down as a Macron-Dolan voter. So now, Lee, number of parties. Your proportional representation is going to lead to multi-party system, and you helpfully said the many party system, an Israeli or Italian system, is not what you want. What do you see it as creating this sort of multi-party system, and why is that a good thing?
Well, I think there are a lot of voters who feel like in every election they're voting for the lesser of two evils. 28% of Americans feel no party represents them right now. A lot of people feel disenchanted from the political system, and that creates a huge crisis of legitimacy. Both of the parties are too big. They're trying to be too many things to too many people. The Democratic Party is too big, can't figure out what it stands for, so it stands for something that is not the Republican Party. The Republican Party can't figure out exactly what it stands for, so it stands for Donald Trump and fighting. If you had more parties competing for more voters, you'd see higher turnout, more voter engagement. And yes, there'd be some challenge of governing coalitions, but I just want to respond to Rick, if I can, about the UK and Canada. So the UK just had an election. There's like 4 or 5 parties in the UK election. Because of the first past the post system, Labour gets 1/3 of the votes, 2/3 of the seats. That seems somewhat unfair. So there's a live conversation in the UK about whether they should move to proportional representation. Canada has had more modest effective polarization, although if you talk to people in Canada, there's more and more concern about Canada being polarized. But Canada does have a kind of multi-party system because the Québécois bloc votes on its own. And there's also a more progressive party. And Canada has more federal politics. And that's the thing that used to keep the US somewhat more multidimensional, fluid, multi-party, is that local parties in the US were very distinct. And it's the national, so I don't want to say it's just first past the post. It's first past the post plus nationalization and geographical sorting. And there's also efforts in Canada to move to a proportional system. In fact, Justin Trudeau in 2015 campaigned on ending first past the post. Of course, when he got into power, he thought, oh, that is first past the post. It's pretty good. But maybe now he wishes that he had stuck with that. Interestingly, I mean, Germany and there are challenges there, but I'll say a few things on Germany. One is that the Germans actually made their system more proportional rather than making it more majoritarian. And just 2 pieces of anecdote. Well, actually, one point in Germany is that now there's a left populist party that's challenging the AfD and taking away some of their support. So that shows the fluidity of the system and the ability of new parties to challenge. I once talked to a German journalist who was here trying to understand what's going on in Washington. He says, one thing that I'm so glad we don't have your 2-party system, that you gave us this mixed proportional system after World War II. And if we had a 2-party system, we would be absolutely at war with each other. It's having those multiple coalitions, and it's challenging because there are challenges, post-COVID inflation, this whole sort of period of collective distemper. But there will be another election, probably the center right, Party, Christian Democratic Party, will come back into leadership, and maybe they will make a coalition with the AfD. But the thing about the coalitions, when you have the center-right party that's dominant and the far-right party is the junior partner, is that they are much less powerful. And you see this time and again in the European party systems where occasionally the right party does get into as a junior partner. And yes, they're anti-immigration, but they don't try to undermine the entire democratic system because they don't have the power. In the US, MAGA has taken over the Republican Party, and in a two-party system, when one party becomes anti-democratic, that is the whole thing. France is in trouble. Interestingly, France and Korea, which both been in the news, are both majoritarian political systems. Well, Korea has a sixth of its election seats chosen by proportional representation, but it's a dominant two-party system. So look, I mean, we're in a moment in which there are a lot of challenges to democracies around the world, but if you have a system where most people feel that the system doesn't represent them, where they feel that there's not really a party that represents them, and you look that's a real problem. You look at any score, VDem, economists, intelligence, democratic rankings, and almost all of the top-ranked countries are multi-party proportional countries. And Rick and I agree with Rick that effective government is important, but in Rick's Illinois Law Review paper, it says, well, the way to measure effective government is not what the World Bank uses to measure effective government, it's how people are voting. So by that measure, US must have the most effective government in the world because people are voting the same way over and over again. So it's contingent on the choices, you see.
So Rick, you use the term two-and-a-half party system. You don't have to own that, but a system perhaps of two strongish parties or coalitions, maybe some others, or I think some people would describe it as making sure we emphasize the coalitional nature of the parties that we have. So what's your vision of the kind of number of parties or party system that comes out of some of these reforms?
So I won't respond initially to what Lee just said, but because I was up here as kind of a critic on this panel, but to say a little bit more about some of the reforms I'm for, and to respond a little bit to Rob. So like Ned, I am a big supporter of the unified primary structure, whether it's a top 4 or a top 5 primary structure. Rob said that we don't believe that the primaries drive people to the extremes. I think you said something like that. If you didn't, that's even better. But I would point people to this book I rely on quite a bit called Rejecting Compromise, Legislators' Fear of Primary Voters, where a group of social scientists actually interviewed legislators in Congress and the state legislatures. And the sort of basic finding of their work was that legislators believe, whether this is true or not, legislators believe that primary voters are much more likely to punish them for compromising than general election voters or donors. And so whatever the empirics might be about the extent to which primaries in fact have this effect, if legislators perceive this, that's what's important. And what they do is they move towards the polls to try to preempt those kinds of challenges because they perceive that's where their risk is. People choose not to run because of the perception that this is the way primary voters behave. And so I think, my own view, speaking for myself, I think Ned probably agrees with me about this, that I do think our structure of primary elections with these low unrepresentative turnouts, which has dropped dramatically over time, as Rob showed, are a significant factor contributing to the increased extremism in our politics. And for that reason, I am a supporter of the top 4 or top 5. It's not so much because I think that might get more independents elected, but it might, or that it might occasionally get a third-party candidate elected, or it might. That's not my main reason for it. My main reason for it is that I think it's become too easy for more factional candidates to get elected through this primary structure, as Rob's Massachusetts example illustrated. And I think we want to try to find ways to make the system more responsive to majorities, to electoral majorities, or general election electoral majorities, which are the most representative electorate we have. And so in a top four system, you're not filtering out at kind of a premature stage candidates who might have difficulty getting through a party primary, but who actually would be the preference of a majority of the general electorate voters. Now, just one or two brief comments, because I don't want to turn this into a debate between Lee and I too much. But so I think that, I guess one point I'm trying to make is that it is easy to say that proportional representation would provide a more representative set of parties. I agree with that in some sense. I mean, if you're an environmentalist and you can vote for a Green Party and it gets 10 or 15% of the vote, and that makes you feel more represented than voting for the Democratic Party, I agree with that. The point I'm trying to emphasize is that at the end of the day, what is critical in our moment is to focus on the end state of what politics or government produces, and the importance of government being able to deliver effectively on the major issues that people care most intensely about. And so I think we do focus too much in a lot of these discussions on what I call the input side to democracy and not on the output side. The other thing which is closely related is I think at the end of the day, people feel most represented or most satisfied with government largely in terms of what it produces for them. So, democratic governments basically promise two things: that everyone has equal standing, equal citizenship, and that they will increase the well-being, however people define that for themselves, of their citizens. And ultimately, I think that's how people judge the legitimacy of democracies. And if they're not delivering, no matter how representative they might be in some sense, I think you still have the same crisis and the same problems of legitimacy. So let me stop there.
So first a comment, or sort of comment of solidarity with Rob, and then maybe I'll direct your question to Rob. On this question of either a single primary day or clustering, I ran a commission 10 plus years ago called the Commission on Political Reform, which actually came out, it was a lot of former government officials, and came out pretty strongly with this. Now, you might imagine, a group of people who are in the two-party system would believe that, but one, I think, it's practical. Two, another thing maybe you indirectly mentioned is that all these things we as political scientists sort of talk about, that increased turnout is sort of, they're hard, and maybe if we're lucky, they're small bits of turnout. And, I think there is a prospect for this, moving from some very low attention primaries to more attention, and perhaps to actually getting the parties interested in the turnout of the primary rather than either staying hands off or supporting one candidate. I mean, maybe there are super PACs, or maybe there are party efforts that say, hey, we've got this day or these days, and we're gonna go at it and get our people out there. So I wasn't on your subcommittee, but we should talk. But secondly, so Rick mentioned now, has put you in the position of my earlier question of like a defender of the two-party system, reformed in a way. That may be unfair to some extent. So either if you want to respond to Rick's comments or say something about the kind of party system or outcome you'd like to come from some of these reforms that we see, rather than just the reform itself, but what it would produce that would be good for us.
Sure. Well, let me, first of all, thank you for the comment on the single day primary. This is always like sort of a minor recommendation that groups have, but it's never been a focal point for reform. Elaine Kmark, who's sitting over here, has written a little bit about it. Other people have written a little bit about it, but it awaits like a major push that maybe someday will happen. But to Rick's point, I guess like the kind of cheap way to respond to Rick is to say, yes, the problem is the perceptions, which are really there. It is certainly true that legislators believe that they are at risk of being primaried if they break with the party orthodoxy, but if the problem is the perception, then you don't change the system, right? You change the perception. So I think that there are a lot of ways in which parties could act to forestall this sort of thing. One of them, again, is if turnout goes up substantially, then the risk of an Eric Cantor style or AOC style primary challenge becomes lower, right? Voters are paying attention. It's less easy for a group that either has a large grassroots following or a group that has other sort of substantial financial resources to catch the incumbent sleeping. I don't know if that solves the problem, but it seems to me that, it's not, I think that the Alaska style thing, I would like to see more states experiment with that, but I think there's a fairly low ceiling to that. So ultimately it's a matter of your own personal, tolerance for how much effort you want to put into advocating things that are 50 years in the future or would require just tremendous effort. I don't know that we are likely to substantially change the primary system in a large number of states in the short run, and maybe we should still advocate for that. I have a friend who's a historian of women's suffrage who always reminds me that it took 70 years for women's suffrage to happen, and if people had told suffragettes 10 years in, like, you know what, you're going to be dead before this happens, maybe they would have abandoned it. But my concern here, and I think the concern of my group, is what can be done in a decade or two. If you think the system is that broken that we need to make changes, then we need to figure out what we can do in a decade as opposed to a dramatic restructuring of the system that might take years and years. But it's just
John,
a
can I just
matter of preference.
Jump in quick on this point in support of what Rick was saying. I'm having a hard time figuring out how you stop current members of Congress or other politicians within the system from having the perception, given what we've seen over the last few years. So one statistic, which is a small n of 10 representatives, but of the 10 Republicans who voted in favor of the impeachment of Trump on the second impeachment over January 6th, the only two that survived going into the next Congress were those who won in the nonpartisan all-candidate system as opposed to party primaries. And the leader of the party, Trump, made it clear that he wanted to use the clout of pressuring members. He was going to go after people who didn't support him, et cetera, et cetera. And so, there's realism in terms of sitting members to know what happened. Again, we can talk about why the Senate failed to convict him and the dynamics of Leader McConnell thinking about maybe to convict or not. But right now we know, the news is telling us that Senator Cassidy from Louisiana, who was a vote to convict Trump, is going to get a primary challenge. So I think it's more than just a perception. I think there is a pretty decent track record that the threat of being primaried is powerful to sort of drive you out of politics, either by not running again or by losing if you try to stick it out. And it's affecting legislative behavior. And I think it's fair to say that it's increasing the degree of polarization and extremism that we've got in the system.
Well, so yes, clearly Donald Trump was successful at mobilizing challenges against legislators that he didn't like. The question you can ask here is that an aberration or is that the new norm? Should we change laws based on things Donald Trump did that no future president may likely do or not? We can't necessarily do that, right? But there are costs to engaging in some sort of advocacy campaign to change things based on Trump. I think that the thing that we've seen more frequently over the past few decades has been this use of the primary calendar to create a narrative about the far right or the far left coming for you. If you take the two Justice Democrats campaigns of 2018, for instance, Justice Democrats very deliberately chose their races spread apart on the calendar so that they could marshal resources behind a campaign, and then they had 2 months of media saying, look, we got one. And that had an effect on making the narrative of 2018 be a story about the left coming for Democrats who were not partisan enough. And this is a strategy they learned from the Club for Growth or from other groups that had done this in years past. It's a story about number one, the primary calendar, and number two, a story about the incentives for groups to use the existing campaign finance system to make a point. So it's entirely possible that other presidents will be like Donald Trump in their ability to mobilize primary voters against their intra-party foes. But no other president has done that in the past. It's kind of a gamble about whether we think others will do that in the future or not.
All right,
And don't forget about 2024, in which Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman were.
That's the same story, yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
We're going to go to the people. Okay. Your average voter, median voter, Elaine Campbell.
Thank you. I have two comments. First of all, Rob, thanks for the shout out on National Primary Day. It's been 10 years and nothing's happened yet, but we'll go on. But one other advantage I would add to your list is that it allows for an intra-party debate to happen clearly. So for instance, the Democrats have never really thrashed out, whether Medicare for all is in fact a better system that we should move towards than, expansions of Obamacare. And, it's sort of mentioned briefly in the presidential campaign, but it's not something the parties have really talked about. And I think for the Republicans, there's a lot of examples, particularly on how to handle immigration. They've ended up with just one extreme one, which I think they'll probably have to walk back when there's nobody to pick the strawberries and the peaches and et cetera, and as harvest time comes around. So I think that's an important function of a national primary day too. And it doesn't happen in the way we do it now, particularly at the congressional level. And then the other thing is really for Ed, but really Rob sort of answered it, I think, which is why there were several ballot propositions for ranked choice voting. And I think almost all of them lost. I think Alaska won, but very, very narrowly. Your data, Rob, seems to indicate that that's because of Republican opposition to that. Anything else going on? Do we have some, I think my colleague Daryl West had some survey data on it with people saying they didn't like it, it was too complicated, et cetera. Do you have any other insights besides simply Republican Party opposition as to why they all failed?
Sure. So you're absolutely right. This reform effort had suffered serious defeat, except in Alaska. I think we should spend a little bit more time understanding exactly why the Republican Party was so hostile to ranked choice voting because of what happened in Alaska. It was an unfortunate fact, but it was a fact that the very first election under the system was the special election, for the House seat. That's the single statewide House seat, and there were two Republican candidates, Sarah Palin, the more extreme one, and then a guy named Nick Begich, who was the more moderate one, and then Mary Petola was the Democrat. And the way the instant runoff process worked, Petola won, and Republicans looked at that and said, wait a second, we had two candidates that collectively had a majority of the support, and yet we're not ending up with this seat. It actually turns out that that was the one election that year where the instant runoff tabulation methodology diverged from the Condorcet methodology. The Condorcet methodology would have produced Nick Begich, the Republican, as the winner, and so the Republican Party would have at least had one of their two candidates win. And I think the Republican Party's backlash to Alaska and to the system would have been dramatically different if it had been the Condorcet system versus the IRV system.
Can I say something interesting about the Republican Party on this? So there are a couple of things. One is the Republican Party in Virginia in the last gubernatorial election decided to have a convention rather than a primary, and B, to use ranked choice voting in their convention. And the reason the party leaders in the state chose that is because They feared that in a traditional primary, a more hardline Republican would succeed, who was running, and that person would not be electable in Virginia. So they understood that the ranked choice voting process would get them to a candidate who had broader electoral appeal, Glenn Youngkin, and they were right about that. And then I think it's 3 of the Republican committees in congressional districts in Virginia decided to use ranked choice voting for the same kinds of reasons in their elections. When the Republicans elect a Speaker of the House, when they have control of the House, they essentially do use ranked choice voting to choose the Speaker. They do it sequentially, not on one ballot, but they have multiple rounds in which the lowest ranking candidate gets dropped, and people then transfer their votes to their next preferences. So it's kind of, it's an interesting dynamic. There are a number of red cities that have adopted ranked choice voting. Utah permits its local governments to use ranked choice voting. I think 20-some jurisdictions in Utah use it. But I think Ned is right. Right now there is at the national level, and a number of Republican-controlled states have actually banned the use of ranked choice voting. You might think the Republican Party would be the party that would most want ranked choice voting because they have these big internal divisions, and it ought to help a party that's got these internal divisions to find their way to more electable candidates. So I think Ned is right about the story. In terms of the recent ballot measure failures, one of the things I have wondered about is, in addition to the opposition from at least one of the major parties, and in some of these states, the Democratic Party was also very opposed to these changes. So in Nevada and in Colorado, the Democratic Party, as we kind of know, I mean, we know the parties are going to generally oppose a lot of these kinds of changes. But in a presidential election that is so intense, with so much oxygen kind of taken out of the room, that all the work you need to do to educate and mobilize people, around significant political reform, which people I think will instinctively be resistant to, and you have to overcome that resistance. Is it not wise to put these measures up during presidential elections? I don't know, but I think that's being discussed.
All right, we have time for one more quick question right here. If you could identify yourself and ask a.
Thank you. I'm Mike Koenig. I'm with the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers, which is really just the coalition of all the major electoral reform organizations that I'm pretty sure most of the group is familiar with. Robert, when you mentioned some of the reasons that the group you were representing had taken a position, I think you acknowledged the question that was not documented or about how they govern, that you didn't really have the information. The real point I'm getting to is that, Richard, you lifted up the idea that we need to focus more on the end state and what government delivers. It seems like a lot of this data, a lot of this discussion tends to focus on the outcome of the election and who wins and whether the different reforms would affect that, whereas I couldn't agree more with you on that point about more research and more data. We have great case studies already, starting Alaska with Kathy Giesel and her story at the state level and how that's affecting bipartisan coalitions coming together and actually getting more, better results for Alaskans. So is there any commentary about the actual study and research that's being done to look at what that end state and how government's delivering?
Well, there's been a lot of research on Alaska, pretty much along the lines that you have suggested. It's a shame that the House race took up so much oxygen because there were a number of state legislative races that produced different results that I think Republicans would be happier about, right? There are a lot of instances where the Republican Party was able to choose stronger, more normal, I guess, Republican candidates than they might otherwise have chosen. So most of the research coming out of Alaska, I think, is promising. But again, Alaska is an unusual state. It's hard to sell that. And I sort of feel like the successes in establishing ranked choice voting in big cities, which more often than not are blue cities as opposed to red cities, again, reinforce that narrative. So I think if the reform community wants to push for a top 4, top 5, whatever ranked choice system, it's going to take a lot of resources. And the real question to ask is, could those resources be better spent in other ways, right? A big national campaign to change primaries takes up money that might otherwise be spent on campaign finance reform or other kinds of things, right? The money for reform is finite, and decisions, I think, need to be made about what is most promising in the short run, not necessarily what is best for democracy if we could have it.
I'll make one quick point on data, very quick. So, because it's an interesting question. One of the things that's very hard to get data on is the difference in the way legislators, let's say in Congress, behave depending on whether they come from competitive districts or the type of primary system that's used. Because the easy data is to look at roll call voting patterns. But the way politics works now, with messaging legislation and the like, by the time you get to the roll call vote, there's a lot of unity that you're going to see. But if you look at any of the people who actually cover Congress, whether it's journalists or congressional scholars who are looking more qualitatively, everyone understands there's significant differences in behavior in people who come from competitive seats versus safe seats. But it's very hard to get a handle on that. We don't have good ways of measuring any of that yet. And political scientists are beginning to develop ways to recognize those kinds of really important distinctions that are hard to see in the roll call vote.
Well, the most important vote that anybody takes is the very first vote they take, which is which party to caucus with.
And with that, we are going to take a 15-minute break. We're going to reassemble here just after 10:45.
Yeah.
We will see you shortly.
Exactly.
discuss one of the chapters, one of the subgroups that was part of the task force, and we are joined by an additional member of that task force who was not on the program, but a pleasant surprise, Hans Knoll of Georgetown University. You're familiar, of course, with Rick, who is up here every panel, and and myself. I think we're going to start with Hans saying some things about part of the work of this subgroup.
You can, I feel like.
I guess I'm going to say a word first.
Okay.
First of all, I'm glad to hear you express the audience resentment of seeing me up here again. I'm going to try to, on this one, I'm not play such a big role, but I wanted to introduce the discussion because this is an area on the presidential nominations process side of the work we did, where I think we're much more interested in being suggestive, calling attention to certain issues. So, in particular, we want to call attention to the fact that most people don't recognize or appreciate at this point, which is that probably the most radical change we made to our democratic processes in the last 50 years was the transformation in the way we select the presidential nominees of the party. The shift from the convention system to the primary election-dominated, voter-dominated system of choice. So for 170 years or so, in one form or another, the elected party officials from throughout the country, early on just members of Congress, but then very soon in the convention system, elected party officials throughout the country had the dominant voice in choosing who would represent the party in the presidential election. And we think, or at least those of us on this subgroup, think that there's a real cost to having really cut those figures out from any formal role in the process. And one of the things we want to do is first identify that issue, remind people of this change and how profound it is, how much it affects the kind of candidates that run and the kind of candidates that succeed, and to raise real questions about whether it would be beneficial to try to find some way to reintroduce some element of elected party figures from throughout the country playing some more formal role in choosing the party's nominees. But we acknowledge that we're pushing back against a very deep political culture in which voters have come to understand and take for granted that it's their right to be the exclusive deciders through the primary election process in choosing the party's nominees. So one suggestion that we put forward is really Hans's idea, and he'll talk about that, and then I'll mention a couple of other ways of thinking about maybe building back in some role like this.
All right, yeah, thanks, Rick. As Rick said, the current system is both sort of snuck up on us, and I think there are a lot of people see it having some flaws, some problems. I think it has some big problems. And so the short version of the proposal is, well, what if you could somehow not turn back the clock, but get a convention to do what the convention was supposed to do and what the reforms that we were put in place that got us to our current place were actually designed to make the convention do. Right. So the current system, I think, is problematic for a whole host of reasons. Turnout, of course, in the primaries is a lot lower than it is in other contests, which means that we call it democratic, but it's not actually representing the whole electorate of any sort. But worse than that, because it's sequential, if you are in one of the early states, you have an outsized influence. If you're in kind of one of the late, early, middle states, depending on how long things go, you get to decide from among those candidates that made it through the early states in the contest. So, 2 tickets out of New Hampshire, 3 tickets out of Iowa kind of conversation that you get, and you get to make that choice. And if you're a later state, which includes some of the larger states and also includes me here in the District of Columbia often, you don't matter at all, right? Because by the time it gets to you, it's already been determined. Right, so that shouldn't be a problem, and wasn't a problem when the organizers put this system into place. Wasn't a problem for them because they sort of imagined still that you would send these delegates to a convention and they would have sort things out. And so it's not a problem that your delegates are chosen later or earlier because they're representative of all the preferences of California or whatever else. The problem is that that doesn't happen, right? You don't get a set of delegates at the convention that are representative of everything else. But worse than that, because instead we get a decision that's sort of based on who can survive early contests which is often about doing well in early contests. It's also about ability to fundraise and everything else. Who can survive those early contests and make it to the end is not necessarily the candidate who would be a compromise candidate from within the party, not necessarily the candidate who would be the Condorcet winner or represent the majority of the party as a whole. And in fact, you don't even often know that. Usually the contest is over, effectively, at a point in which the winning candidate has won not a majority, and often far below a majority of the delegates, right? That's when it's not done, but it's effectively, we know it's going to be Trump or whatever. It's settled at that point. Because people drop out and then they rack up delegates later on. So that means that those delegates don't get to have that conversation of reflecting and bargaining, which is the whole point of representative democracy, right? And if we think representative democracy is a good idea in general, which since we're all talking about how we elect representatives to Congress, I think we're on board with that, then representative democracy is a good idea and we could have it at the convention, right? So a convention that is actually representative of the party voters in the respective states would make a better decision. Right, so that's the goal, or the logic. Then how would you maybe get there? Well, you would get there if you do not have a clear majority of delegates on that first ballot. Okay? And how would you get there with that? Well, you need to make sure that you don't have the sort of advantages to being the number one candidate that we currently have. In the Republican Party, at a certain point, you often have winner-take-all contests in states, or winner-take-all contests by congressional districts. In the Democratic Party, there's some form of proportional representation everywhere, but it's still at the congressional district level, and the number of delegates is such that you could still end up not getting anywhere if you only have 10, 15, 20% of the delegates, which means that you end up winning with 30, 40% of the delegates, 34% of the vote. To move on. So if you had it so that it was easier to stick around because it was more proportional and your 10, 20, 25% victory in an early state meant you stuck around and you had your representation continuing, that would perhaps get you to those contested conventions. And then the other recommendation is whatever we can do to kind of make it so that there's not this sort of long slog of attrition, where people who are in the process, they have to get to the next contest, to the next contest, to the next contest, and they run out of money and they have to drop out. So perhaps a shorter contest, one that is not designed to quickly get you to a majority. Right now, a lot of the thinking is, well, but we do need to get you quickly to a majority because that's the only way you get to an ultimate, an answer that won't be a contested convention. If anything, both parties are a little bit nervous about contested conventions, so they're rigging the system in a way that just discourages it to have that. The suggestion would be to go the other direction and encourage a contested convention, encourage more candidates to get to the final end with a whole bunch of different delegates. And then the Bernie Sanders delegates and the Joe Biden delegates and the other delegates of all the candidates that dropped out in 2020, for instance, would get to negotiate amongst each other and discuss. And they do that already to some great degree, but the representation in the convention is not a reflection of the party preferences. And so that's the goal and that's the idea. And I've written a couple of places about ways in which this might help build up and strengthen our hollow state parties, because now they would have to pay more attention to these kinds of things, would encourage people in the party to learn more about negotiating and working with each other and all these other kinds of sort of knockoff effects. I didn't come here prepared with a presentation of all the other details, but I think that touches on the main issues that we raised in the piece.
Yeah, I should thank Hans for being willing to, he wasn't originally part of the panel, to come up from the floor and present, so thanks. I'll just mention a couple of other ideas that we talk about in the chapter for building back in some role for party elected figures. These are really Elaine Kmark's ideas. Elaine was part of this subgroup, and she can speak for herself as she's been known to do. But one obvious way of doing it would be to build up the role of superdelegates, to increase the percentage of superdelegates in the Democratic Party, to have superdelegates in the Republican Party. I mean, again, this obviously pushes back against the dominant political culture right now, but unless we start having these kinds of conversations about whether what we have lost, would it be a good thing? we can't even get to the point of really talking about practical possibilities. Another possibility that Elaine has raised is the candidates who want to run could meet privately with members of Congress from their party, and the party could vote to give an endorsement to some number of candidates before the primary election season begins, so that you'd have some sense, some cue, some signal from elected party figures in Congress about how they thought about these various candidates. So those are a couple of other ideas. Massachusetts, by the way, and some other states, I think, but Massachusetts has a version of this at the state level. So to run as a Democrat in the primary elections, you first have to succeed at a state party convention and getting something like 15% of the votes at the convention, and only then can you run in the Democratic primary. So it's a pre-filtering mechanism. I should also say, by the way, because in our culture, these ideas seem so kind of foreign, in most other democracies, they do not choose their party leaders, the people who are candidates to become chief executive, through this kind of primary election process. So the extreme version of the old system still exists in Australia, where, at least for one of the political parties I know, they choose, the parties in parliament choose the party leader. That's it. There is no other participatory role. In the UK, the Conservative Party, and we've just been through this recently again, we've been through it multiple times in recent years as they cycle through party leaders, the elected members in Parliament winnow down the potential party leaders to 2 candidates. And then they submit those 2 candidates to their electorate. And I should also say, in these countries that have a role like that for their electorate, these electorates are much, much smaller than in the United States. So in the United States, to become a party member, you just check a box when you register. In the UK, or in many countries, you have to be more engaged. Maybe you have to pay an annual dues or whatever. So even when the Tory party submits 2 candidates to their voters are, it's like 130,000 people. It's not, even though millions end up voting in the general election. So we are actually quite an outlier in the democratic world in how participatory or how voter-dominated, since the post-1968 era, our processes of choosing presidential nominees are. So let me stop there in the nominations process, turn it over to John about the work we did on ideas concerning the presidential primary debate process.
Sure, and let me start a little with a broader question. I think the way of describing our group, again, we didn't come to extreme specific consensus, but we all believe that the parties could play something of a bigger role and should play a bigger role in the primary process. I guess I would say I was probably more on the minimalist side of that divide, but I still do believe that. Hans's proposal of the conventions and Elaine's should have more formal peer review, or to have superdelegates. I see some value in that. I guess I think there's just even a fair amount of value in the stuff that we already do related to the party. People going to Iowa are seeking endorsements from state legislators and local politicians in New Hampshire as well. So I guess I'd like to see more of that, and parties think more constructively about ways in which they can make people run the gauntlet through the party structure to meet the party people. I worry a little more that by having the party put its stamp on in some way, whether a superdelegate out there, we're really not willing to follow through on that, or people might react to that and say, oh, the party, official party is out of touch, nominated this person, we're going to go the other way, or if we really elect somebody just using the superdelegates. I guess I'm cautious about that, but I still think it's important to think of ways in which we are often bringing in outsiders, and look, Donald Trump, very much of an outsider, and in some ways he did have to run through the party gauntlet. He probably, we probably could have had him run a little bit more through this, but didn't end up totally outside of the system. So I think ways in which we can do that are helpful. One of those ways is the debate process. And effectively the way our primaries work, of course, even before we start voting, we have now essentially almost a year period where in theory, we have all these candidates who are the rare times you see them together, a number of these debates. And we were just a little unsure and unhappy what happened with these debates. I will say, once we already had our conversation and wrote much of this, there were three big developments on the campaign trail that maybe we wouldn't have anticipated. One, our debate commission and the general election was sort of breaking down. That didn't really happen this time. Our Republican candidate decided not to participate in the debates. And then, of course, we changed the party nominee right before the convention. And just a quick few things on those to sort of highlight some of the things we care about. On the Biden dropping out before the convention, I think, even though I'm more cautious about giving the convention this role generally, I mean, I think obviously, we should think a little bit more about emergency procedures and people talked about that. Should we have had a mini primary, a way in which the party showcased potential candidates and really put it to the convention? With the sitting vice president, I think probably wasn't that likely to happen, but imagine a case where it's not the sitting vice president, right? A party might need to do that. I'm not sure, though, it would make sense to think of that as broadly, in the sense that we did have many voters, I mean, some of it was political for the Republican side, saying, I think Kamala Harris would have been better off had she run in a primary process, right? She would have been a better candidate. She would have had to go through the gauntlet even if she went through in 2020 or if she'd gone through before. There were some people saying it was illegitimate. Again, I think that might be, more political than not, but I think some people do think there's a little bit of a legitimacy that you're going to go before the voters. I think that's pretty deeply ingrained in us. So thinking about ways which maybe a party should consider emergency procedures, but also recognizing some of the benefits we have of a candidate, especially one who's never run at the national level, having to go through this long process and introducing themselves to the voters and being a better candidate is something we should remember. On the debates themselves, I think there's a big worry, and I think it's more from the Republican side, but there are a couple things. One, I think Republicans in the general election debates and in the primary debates are worried about the moderators, right? Who are they going to get? Are they going to go to mainstream media where they're going to feel like a moderator is not asking the types of questions that Republican voters care about? And I think that's a real issue. I think it's also an issue in the general election where the debate commission, which did very good work for many years, probably didn't reflect the current Republican Party and its board and membership, but also really didn't get around this problem of who's going to host these debates and how are both parties going to feel comfortable doing it. And so I think that's something that we are really going to have to wrestle with. We're going to have to make it attractive to people to join these debates. I think, with the exception of Donald Trump, who's a weird case of a former president, almost every candidate is going to want to get into these debates. But I do think sort of making it more attractive, having the parties have a greater role, whether they actually run them or they at least closely oversee them and don't turn it over simply to media organizations, and especially on the Republican side, that they kind of get them to reflect the kind of questions that Republican voters are going to want to hear, which I think is a little bit of a disconnect typically with mainstream media.
Elaine, since you were on the task force subgroup on this and you have all the experience you have with the Democratic convention, do you want to weigh in and contribute to the conversation about a role for elected party figures?
It's interesting to think about delegates, okay? If you were to try to get rid of the primaries and simply have the convention nominate, the question is who should be in that room? And the most interesting thing that is always forgotten is that there are maybe 50 times, there's approximately 5,000 people on the Democratic side and on the Republican side who actually have legitimacy to make decisions for the parties. And they're completely forgotten. They're the state committee members. In every state, there's a Democratic state committee, a Republican state committee. They get elected, okay, in sort of small areas. A lot of times there's no competition for it, et cetera. But year in and year out, they do the business of the party in terms of elections, nominations, setting up things, fundraising, et cetera. There's a lot of them. So the delegates kind of come in at the last minute. They're elected as the result of a primary, right, which can go in a direction, as we've seen often, that doesn't really reflect the rest of the party. But the actual state committee members actually are the party. That is the party. Nobody even knows about them, right? Let alone ever writes about them or whatever, although hats off to Ray LaRaja, who has done some great work on this. But my point here is that if you were to really think radically about this, and you wanted to go back to a nominating convention that had some deliberative aspects, you really have to think about the role of the delegates, which at this point are kind of, in the old days, who were the delegates? The delegates were the state committee members, frankly, okay? The delegates were the elected officials. They were the county committee chairman, et cetera. That's who they were. Now we have two different decision classes, right? We have the state committees making decisions about everything from senator, governor, House members, et cetera, and we have these delegates, which may or may not be very representative of the party. So I would just, I mean, if you were to go with Hans, go with your thinking, that would be, I think, something to put in there. In terms of the superdelegates, my proposal is very modest, which is that we simply use them as to give a sort of stamp of approval on candidates. And what that means is you say yes to Bernie Sanders. After all, he's been in Congress for 30 years. He kind of knows a little bit about the world and a little bit about American government. And you say no to Marianne Williamson, okay, who has no business running for president and no business taking up time on a debate stage. So that's a sort of modest proposal to just kind of get the parties into the mode of clearing the field out at least a little bit. And I think that, frankly, when you look at the few Democratic debates that happened before COVID set in and the whole, thing, ended in 2020, there was Bernie and Biden, and as I said before, they needed to have a real debate about Medicare for all. And it's a big idea. It's a big thing. Maybe it's time for us to end this crazy system we have. You couldn't have that debate because you had to give time to Marianne Williamson and whoever else, all the other marginal candidates on the stage. So that's why I say it's a very modest proposal. And secondly, it would allow the candidates to go in front of a closed congressional caucus and a closed gubernatorial caucus and then they would have to say things like, yeah, I want to build a wall. People would say, okay, all right, maybe that's not a bad idea. And then when Trump would say, and I want to have Mexico pay for it, everybody would look at him like he was crazy. And if it was closed, you could say, huh? How on earth would you do that? You mean we're going to invade Mexico and take it over to make them pay for the wall? Come on. So it would keep the sort of nutty ideas out of the nutty but attractive ideas out of the mainstream, and we didn't used to have that many just purely unrealistic, crazy ideas out there being floated and voters taking seriously. The one today is the $2 trillion cut in the federal budget that they're going to do in 2 years. Huh? Come on. That's purely ridiculous. You just want, all I'm saying here, it's a very it's a very modest proposal, is let's get some of the sort of nuttiness out of the presidential primary system so that the candidates that are in there can concentrate on real things, and so that there can be an argument over things that are reality-based, as opposed to, just sort of pie in the sky.
Why don't we open it up for questions from the floor, since we don't have a huge amount of time here? I think Bill Galston.
Thank you.
I'm really interested in exploring what I think has been dubbed the Massachusetts model. The idea that there would be a body, that stands between the aspirants and the primary process and establishes some sort of threshold of support. Let's, call it the Marianne Williamson Death Committee or something. But at any rate, that's its job. I'm interested in exploring the dynamics of that. That is, what would happen if such a body were empowered at the national level to behave in that fashion? My hunch is that with that power would come increased scrutiny to the process whereby people are elected. And if you had a lot of state party officials, then suddenly routine elections would become much more visible and much more contested. And you would have a sort of pre-primary going on, in the selection process for people who would then sit in this vetting body and make go, no-go decisions on specific candidates. So that's just off the top of my head, but people who've had more experience in this, what kind of dynamics of change would such a proposal set in motion?
Sure.
We do have a historical example here, and of course, it doesn't necessarily go with our overall interest in this group of sort of a less polarized politics. But how did Barry Goldwater win the 1964 convention? His the real conservatives spent 4 years before 1964 taking over precinct by precinct, county by county, the state apparatus. And in those days, the state apparatus were largely the people who, in fact, became delegates. They were almost entirely one and the same. And so when, I wrote this in one of my books. I went back and looked at all the New York Times pieces from that era. And it's so funny because on the one hand, you've got Goldwater racking up delegates, and you've got the New York Times writing about the latest primary as if Nelson Rockefeller was still alive, long after the guy was dead. Okay, it's just a fascinating thing especially when we realize in hindsight what was happening, and then you look at the coverage of it, and they were totally out of sync. So, Bill, you're right. I mean, presidential aspirants, particularly with a strong ideological bent, would pay a lot of attention to who's on the state committee, who's the state party chair, who's the county commissioner of Cuyahoga County. I mean, a lot of that. And frankly, parties would then become much more important because they would then have a significant say in the nomination process, which they used to have. Okay, and one of the things that's sort of a little fascinating thing is Henry Ford, way back in the early part of the 20th century, wanted to be president. And he told the Republican Party leaders in, I think it was Michigan, that yes, he wanted to be president. And they said, "Are you crazy?" No. I mean, now this guy was as powerful as he was an Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos of his day. I'm not sure if anybody was an Elon Musk, but he was way up there in terms of money and prestige and power. And the Republican Party said, "No, we don't think you're qualified to be president." And that was the end of it. So, I mean, it's very interesting, the dynamic that happens when it's a different mode of nomination altogether.
I mean, I guess one thing I would worry, and maybe this would be taken care of over time, would be initially there may be people saying, "Who are these crusty old people? We don't know who they are." They're putting their stamp. In fact, that's sort of a stamp of the old Republican Party. I want to vote for somebody real. And in fact, it's a badge of honor not to get that. Now, if it is taken more serious, so I guess, I mean, I agree with Elaine, I think 90% of the way. I want to make candidates go through all these interesting processes, meet elected officials, go to closed caucus, to talk to the legislators. But I do worry about the stamp of approval, or at the end of the day, the superdelegates. I don't mind them being there. I think it's good, but maybe the Democratic rule now of they don't vote in the first round and they vote later, because I think people are attached to this idea that we are electing somebody from the people. That's the primary mode, and who are these other people? So, and then if we went there, I guess I would, not that I want to go back to King Caucus particularly, but I think, our elected officials should form a good chunk of that body, all right? To people that candidates who are from or outsiders have to go before or talk to or go through some process. I mean, or maybe if you want the seal of approval, that's another thing. But still, I think that's the kind of thing that you want to think about who those people are. And right now, they're people who I think people don't really trust as being people that they know as part of their party.
The last question from Ray.
I just want to talk about the Massachusetts model. I mean, they're in Massachusetts. Rob's in Massachusetts.
It's got Barry Goldwater and Massachusetts model.
So you gave me an idea for a research project here, but okay, I'm in a college town, Amherst. The people who want to be delegates, they come out of the woodwork and flood the convention. But I'm curious to know what happens in Worcester, Rob, which is more of a working class town, even though there's colleges. Do you see who are the people going to the convention to make those approvals? Because we do know that some candidates got shuffled off and they were like the kind of outsider candidates, which was pretty interesting.
Worcester is where the convention is held every year, which maybe makes it a bigger deal, but they're all sort of party hacks, I guess you might say. I mean, I'm sure I'm insulting people that are watching the live stream or whatever. But to speak to Ray's point, I mean, anybody in Massachusetts has stories about the injustice of the model. In 2006, Deval Patrick, who ultimately became governor, was sort of the anti-establishment candidate, and the Democratic establishment found, they manipulated somebody who was candidate number 3 to get him above the threshold to harm Patrick. 4 years later, or 6 years later, when Elizabeth Warren ran, there was substantial opposition, and oddly enough, among progressives to Warren, who seemed to be handpicked by the party leaders. And the governor very aggressively pushed delegates to not support what would have been Warren's progressive challengers. So in many ways, it's an old school convention model. You have prominent politicians, the speaker, the governor, who control bunches of delegates that they can get to support somebody or not. It looks very corrupt to voters. So I think the challenge would be that somebody would have to be the face of this, right? So you think about what happened with Debbie Wasserman Schultz when she had to make those decisions a few years back. You'd need a party leader who was willing to be the face of a process people thought was very corrupt that was designed to do that.
Worcester also has a billboard that says, like Rome, Worcester was built on 7 hills. So,
I'd love to continue the
kidding.
discussion because there's a lot, I can tell there's a lot of energy around the issues, but to keep things on time, I'm going to close it off here. So thank you, and then we'll do the next panel.
Keynes Roan. I'm joined by Ray LaRaja, who's the task force leader of the campaign finance group of which I'm a part. We have several other members. Well, we have one other member, Rob Boatwright, who's here, and then someone who graciously contributed, even though he's not an official member, so Ben Ginsberg can disown any part of the report he doesn't like, since he's only a voluntary partial contributor. This has been a great task force to be a part of. What I'm going to do is talk about some general trends and how these trends contribute to extremism and polarization in our campaign finance system, and then Ray's going to talk about our reforms. So one of the largest trends that's occurred over the past several decades is that individuals are now the primary source of contributions for candidates. So if we were having this discussion in the 1990s, for instance, we'd be talking a lot about PACs. That's where the academic literature and the policy world focused rightfully at the time. But individuals have greatly swamped PACs, as the graph from Mike Barber shows, and then by Molly Reynolds, who's down the street at Brookings, has some recent data. What you can see is even incumbent House members now raise on parity from individuals and PACs. And if you look at challengers or either type of Senate candidate, an incumbent or challenger, they're raising primarily from individuals. And of course, party is a very low contributor at this point to most candidates. Hard. This is non-independent spending. I'll get to independent spending in a moment. Another major trend is that most of that spending is coming from out of state, and that for members is also out of district, but to combine the two types of candidates, we've done in and out of state contributions. We don't have time to go into it here, but there's excellent work that shows that that's coming from a very small number of zip codes. I am one of those zip codes, being in the Silicon Valley area. You, if you live in DC, are also one of those zip codes, or in outside in the Maryland or Virginia suburbs. But we might like that we're heavily represented, but for the country, that's arguably a huge issue for representation in terms of where candidates are being supported. The other major trend to keep in mind is that independent spending has skyrocketed. That starts after the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act in 2002, and then really takes off after Citizens United. And so most of the money that's coming into elections now is, while still hard money takes a large portion of it, because individuals are such a large source of the independent spending, this is even more, that creates an even greater dominance from individuals. Okay, so very briefly, some key developments that have happened over these past few decades that have contributed to these trends. One development that I think sometimes gets a little bit underplayed in terms of just the role that campaign finance is playing in the day-to-day operations of Congress is that in the 1990s, when the Republicans took the 104th Congress, right, they instituted term limits for committee chairmanships. There were good intentions in thinking that maybe seniority is overrated. The Democrats, while not instituting term limits, quickly de-emphasized the role of seniority. So very quickly, fundraising became a primary determinant of whether you'd be a committee chair or have certain key committee assignments. It's not clear that fundraising necessarily would have had such a large role, except for some other developments that happened at the same time. So we're in the mid-90s, and what comes into being? Obviously, the internet. Right, well, so I'm in Silicon Valley, so it's really obvious to me. But that's rising up in the 1990s, and what that means is that parties' dominance over raising funds for candidates is being quickly depleted because the internet enables challengers to raise much more easily funding from particularly out-of-state donors and out-of-district donors. So the parties have to keep their incumbents in office, have to try to catch up. Also in the mid-1990s, John McCain and Russ Feingold begin their efforts to try to reform the system. So they're doing this, right as the seniority system is shifting for committees and right as the internet is massively changing the way that fundraising works. So their intent is sort of, I would argue, and others have argued, from the system that really is pre-internet, pre-seniority being removed from determining the chairmanships, And they come in with this well-intentioned reform, the Bipartisan Campaign Act of 2002, which greatly kneecaps parties and their ability to play the central role in fundraising. So soft money for parties is eliminated, and therefore increasing the role of this outside spending. Along comes Citizens United in 2010, which enables corporate entities, which of course doesn't just include corporations, but nonprofits, labor unions, other organizations, to contribute in unlimited ways to candidates. That, again, consistent with the earlier figure, greatly increases the role of independent spending and individuals. So parties are, again, largely left out of the picture. Parties themselves can form independent super PACs. We do go into that in the chapter, so we're not unaware of that. But again, parties relative to individuals have become a much less important part of the picture. And then I just note something that doesn't get as much attention, but is just worth, usually when I mention this, at least in academic audiences, maybe everyone here knows this, but that as a writer in 2014, Congress, led by the Democrats on this rider, wants to enable parties to raise additional funds for election litigation. Not surprisingly, as we point out in our chapter, a lot of election litigation spending has gone up since 2014. So Ray will talk about our recommendation on that regard. A few implications for polarization and extremism. So individual donors tend to be more ideologically extreme, particularly on domestic issues, than rank and file partisans. These data are from self-reported donors in the Congressional Election Study over time. As you can see, the self-reported donors suggest that they're more extreme. Some co-authors, I know Rob plugged his book, I'll just plug a little, a paper. So what we went in and did, this is with Mike Barber, Josh Clinton, and Greg Huber. We went in and took the FEC data on who's an actual donor, recognizing that sometimes these self-reports are not as perfectly reliable as you'd like. We surveyed actual donors on a variety of policy issues. In a forthcoming paper that we have, we show that on a wide range of issues, validated donors are more extreme than their other partisans are. And this includes people who report being strong partisans. And this also includes people who we have verifiable information are affluent. So sometimes we think of donors as the affluent as being equivalent. What we show is that no, donors are much more extreme than the affluent. The affluent actually look much more like the general population when you compare them to, relative to donors. So implications for polarization and extremism, this greater reliance on individual donors over institutional ones such as parties and interest groups tends to produce polarization. That's shown in a number of different papers in different ways. Our argument, as we point out in this chapter, is that parties tend to want to win elections. So their incentive is to support candidates who are likely to win, who tend to be more moderate candidates. We define polarization in the chapter in two ways. We discuss this sort of ideological polarization, which is candidates who are further apart. We also discuss extremism, which could be candidates who are illiberal in the classic John Stuart Mill sense. I might say the AEI sense of the word, I'm not sure. That sense of the word, and uncivil. And there's an increasing amount of research, though smaller amounts since it's still developing, that suggests that individual donors are attracted to candidates who can gain media attention in our disparate media environment by being uncivil. So the Joe Wilson, you lie, that brings in a lot of funding. And there's recent research that suggests that, say, candidates who support conspiracy theories, they receive more spending in the primaries from that type of more what we would call extremist activity. This reliance on individual donors is exacerbated by this increased importance of independent spending. And as we note in the chapter, that's particularly relevant in the primaries. So while in general elections, the independent groups may contribute to just their party winning the election, in the primaries, these independent groups will often support the more extremist candidate. And as we note, the parties have increasingly challenged electoral outcomes consistent with the change in the law in 2014. And I know Ray's also going to talk about the lack of transparency and accountability. In the chapter, we sort of note Again, this group certainly knows this, though I have presented at law schools where people don't know this, so which really surprised me not being in law school, which is that super PACs do have to report their donors, so that's actually, less of a transparency problem, but of course the 501c4s do not. And as we know, the 501c4s can donate unlimited amounts to the super PAC, so that's where this lack of transparency comes into place.
So can you pull up the next set of slides here? Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so that's the current terrain on campaign money and how it supports extremism. Thanks, Brandis. So we approach solutions with a heavy dose of realism. And as others have said, the dynamics of extremism are pretty complex, and campaign finance is just one part. And everybody in this field knows the law of unintended consequences. But that said, we do have some ideas about how to soften some of these polarizing edges, and they're not necessarily from the menu of reform advocates. So let me start with what is unlikely to work. These are sometimes on the breakfast menu of many reform groups: lower contribution limits, encourage small donors with subsidies, and trying to overturn Citizens United. So the first two are simply going to worsen the situation, okay? Tighter limits make politicians rely more on super PACs, okay? They need the money. And many small donor programs are likely to bring out polarized donors. I'm doing a book on this now about who small donors are and who they're giving to. And it's going to boost polarizing candidates. So on Citizens United, our members had very different views on this. Some argued it protects free speech. Others thought the ruling undermined democratic norms. But almost all of us agreed that it's going to be hard to change longstanding jurisprudence. And so we chose the pragmatic route of changing regulations rather than trying to change the Constitution. Okay, so here's our first recommendation. Basically, make political parties great again. And that's a theme you've been hearing throughout these sessions: making parties stronger. They're the broadest, most representative institutions, and they're easiest to hold accountable, unlike interest groups. So we want to raise the contribution limits, let them work more closely with their candidates by taking away restrictions on coordinated activities. And if there's going to be any public funding, why not consider the parties? Let me focus on this first point here in this graph about raising limits. It shows how poorly party organizations have fared since the amendments to the Federal Election Campaign Act in '74. So back then, parties could raise about $20,000 from individual donors per year. That was never adjusted for inflation. If they did adjust, right now, party committees would be able to raise about over $130,000 per year from an individual donor. But today, under McCain-Feingold, which is what Brandis was talking about, the BCRA, Bipartisan Campaign Act, they could only raise about $41,000. So why not just give them the same amounts that they were getting post-Watergate? Just change that, and because McCain-Feingold actually hurt them. Now, of course, party leaders have figured out a way around the system, but super PACs, all that. But not having the money within the organization means less transparency, less accountability, less time spent on, less potential for investments in party building, especially true for state parties. Look at the one I circled here, that blue circle. It's more difficult than ever for state parties to raise the funds and engage in federal elections, which we think is a mistake. So the second thing was improving disclosure. We're for both more and less disclosure at different ends of the donor spectrum. We want more transparency for major donors who give to 501c4s, what Brandis alluded to, who are not compelled to disclose donations. Now, there are practical and constitutional concerns about compelled donations, about compelled disclosure, and we discuss these in the book. But on balance, we think greater transparency strengthens accountability mechanisms. At the same time, we seek less transparency for smaller donors because we think it creates kind of a chilling effect for those who are not intense partisans. Anonymity may encourage more citizens who have mixed views, mixed political views. And, having your name made public can create some social problems. I'll give you, what if you're a moderately conservative potential donor in a college town like mine? So I did one mashup one time showing the geography of donors in Amherst. There was one red dot. It happened to be my son's 5th grade teacher. I didn't tell my wife. Maybe we should raise the donor disclosure threshold from $200 to $1,000. You're not going to be corrupted by $1,000. So, and in addition to that, we think there should be anti-retaliation to prevent donors from being, having some type of retaliation by their employers. Okay, the third thing is similar to the one I talked about for parties, increasing finance for traditional multi-PACs. Again, we're not advocating for large increases, but recommending that these limits rise with inflation as it was in the Watergate period. The relative value of a PAC contribution has plummeted, okay? And we're giving much more weight to ideological donors, as Brand has pointed out, who spend through independent elections and also just individual donors. So, PACs should be able to give $32,000 instead of just the same $5,000 that was back in 1974, still not adjusted for inflation, okay? And yeah, PACs represent business interests. I'll get no arguments in this venue, but some people are concerned about that. But they don't give to extremist candidates. So that's something to balance out the system. The last two are encouraging local experimentation with subsidies for small donors in places like Seattle, New York City. We don't think these programs, as they are currently designed, are going to work that well because small donors are as polarized as large donors. We kind of like how New York State does it, and Michael Malbin, who's another political scientist, has written about this. Subsidies should only go to voters within the candidate's district. That's how New York State does it. And this would lessen the influence of those national activists that we've been talking about. It'll create some pluralism in the system. Last, we believe that the party should give up those special litigation accounts. It stands to reason if you have money for litigation, you're going to do litigation. And we think that creates bad incentives. It adds to voter skepticism and may even radicalize voters when they see their candidates lose. So we have to ask, what about feasibility? We need to think about public opinion, obviously. We need to think about political insiders regarding the public. I mean, they hate, any type of, they hate the current system, obviously, and they want proposals that we would probably oppose. But our proposals are not radical, and it seems reasonable, at least, fair-minded, to increase things up with inflation. And they would favor transparency. That's something they very much like, while protecting small donors. I think they would buy into that. They're not crazy about the idea of public subsidies, but maybe, I don't know how they would feel about, we could poll test what they feel about subsidies going in the districts. Regarding the party insiders, all right, this is always a big one. We think there's something here for both parties. Democrats like egalitarian approaches, like disclosure, public financing, and Republicans want a bigger role for parties and PACs. Both parties see reason to support rules that give more privacy to small donors and passing anti-retaliation legislation. So there you have it. Those are our summary of broad recommendations with some details in the book. So we'll take some questions now.
Yeah, I think they're, okay.
Thank you. I have Mark Schmidt, New America. I have like a pure question. What's the line you're drawing, Ray, between the subsidies you think are okay? Like you're against small donor subsidies to incentivize small donors, like I assume a matching system. Sounds like you're okay with something like Seattle's voucher system. What about like the Minnesota tax credit system, for example, which, by the way, has a big role for parties in there? Where's the line you're drawing between subsidies you like and subsidies you don't like?
So what I'm really concerned about is subsidies for national activists. That's a big one, and that's what a national subsidy program would do. And I think you've done some research here. You might want to talk about paying attention to donors. When they disagree, when those donors, including small donors, disagree with their district constituents, the national level activists who give money, the members side with them. So I think we need to introduce more localism, have the members spend more time raising money in their district constituencies. Say, wow, if you give me money, it's going to be 8 times as much. I don't have a problem with that. It'll encourage maybe more organization building in these districts. The parties could be a part of this. So I like that. I also like Minnesota. Subsidies for parties is a good one.
I think there's another question. Yeah.
You mentioned the amount of money that comes from out of state to candidates. What about limits to where the money comes from? So if you're running in a House district, I ran VA 10 when in the primary, the ranked choice primary that was mentioned earlier. And I ran specifically so I could speak to somebody in power. But what I found was that they were busy a lot of times out of state raising money. And I, as an individual citizen who's lived there my whole life, could not actually speak to anyone, even though I had paid the party the fee to run. Is there a way that we can limit so people can actually get in the room with the representatives?
Yeah, I'm personally supportive of, there are constitutional issues in House and Senate races, I believe, but I would sort of from just a pure personal preference, and I think that states that have, a number of states, as already mentioned, have restrictions of varying sorts across states on out-of-state donations to their state legislative races, clearly designed with the intention of, I think the way you'd have to do it constitutionally here would be on the House and Senate would be some sort of subsidy, to make it, because you're not, you can't prevent others from contributing and spending, but you could subsidize in some way. But yeah, I'm very, in my work that relates to this but isn't directly on this, very concerned about how this relates to issues like trust in government, the sense that people feel represented, and I would argue correctly feel they're represented if the member is voting most of the time with kind of the national donorate rather than district opinion.
Thank you. We've gotten some of the international perspective on some of the earlier panels today. Would either of you be able to speak to kind of maybe the UK model, some of the other international models on much tighter controls, and you think that might not work in the US? Do you feel like it works in other countries and kind of increasing public trust in financing, increasing just the kind of general moderateness of the election itself?
I don't think there's an election that goes by in Europe which isn't a scandal about money going under the table. They have shorter elections. The parties are stronger. So there's some difficulties of making direct comparisons. The state tells candidates how much they can put on TV. That's not going to work here. So, so I think they're of limited applicability. You might be different on this, but.
No, I'd say largely so. I think that some of our proposals that are designed to strengthen parties, it's not a direct analog, but I would say that we believe that strengthening parties would moderate what's happening. And to the extent that you believe that, again, there are all these comparisons that Rick and Lee talked about. There are a lot of other comparisons going on in terms of moderation, but I think that a more party-centered system would be beneficial and then wouldn't have these constitutional issues.
I was curious to get your thoughts about how the FEC fits into all of this, perhaps kind of enhancing its ability to deal with the kind of abuses and violations in campaign finance and election law that are pretty common, I would say, in modern American elections.
Yeah, that's a challenging question. Maybe we should turn to someone like Ben for that. We didn't really talk much about the FEC in our sessions because we weren't sure that we could make a difference there at this point. it's deadlocked in many issues, although they do have agreements on some. I think if the laws weren't so complicated and groups weren't trying, so much money was being pushed outside the system, I think it'd be easier to regulate the system. So I'll just say that. But I have no recommendations on how to reconstitute the commission or add to it. Maybe somebody here, as anybody else on our group, our task force, have ideas on that? It's a good question, but we didn't address it.
Yeah, I think Ray said it well that, obviously one of the big issues people are concerned about is the extent to which independent spending is more or less coordinated. But, the easiest fix to that would be to enable parties to, to much more directly enable parties to be coordinated with candidates. And then you wouldn't have to be regulating all this, which seems like a very, an almost impossible task.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Begin by just giving you a little bit of the history of this. We actually started several years ago. It's been a while, this project. Thank you, Ned, for nodding. And I'll thank all the people who should be thanked beyond our supporters who were thanked at the beginning when I finish. But I will say, I was one of the people who kind of helped conceptualize this with Ned and Rick and bring it into being. And so I would like to give you this inaugural perspective. In my profound naivete, I expected there'd be much more consensus among our committee members, our task force members, than there was. We aimed for, I think this was a sensible, right, and necessary thing that we did. Pretty broad and inclusive group, philosophically, and in terms of where they were at. And of course, you might have noticed that we bridge the academic disciplines of law and political science primarily. And where we, I think, got some consensus among our working groups, which you heard in terms of particularly, for example, campaign finance on some proposals and on primary reform, they were, I think you've grasped, on pretty incremental reforms. And I think there's a lesson in that where we were dealing with potentially very big structural changes, and it's hard to imagine a bigger structural change than in the structure of the party system in the United States as a result of a pretty decisive shift from the single-member district system to multi-member PR. We were deeply split, and I'd say honorably and forthrightly split between different perspectives, different visions, and so on. I'm going to kind of reveal where I've come out and why. But before that, I'll say that I think it's very important to appreciate the way that reforms of an institutional nature are context sensitive. And what works in another context, in Europe or elsewhere, might not work in the same way in the United States. And what worked in the US in terms of our primary system, our party system, in a different historical era, may not be working so well in the current historical era, which is precisely what gave rise to our task force. I will also note about electoral systems, something that's been on my mind as a comparativist, because I am not an expert on American politics. I'm a scholar of democracy comparatively. So I have a very kind of panoramic view about how electoral systems and other reforms have kind of fit together in a democratic package in other countries. And so one could also note, for example, how do the big structural realities of electoral systems fit with the structure of executive government? What we can note also about PR systems in Europe is that they're all parliamentary systems or parliamentary presidential systems. There are a few examples of purely presidential systems that have PR. Brazil is one notable example. And questions have been raised about how well presidentialism fits with a multi-party system, which PR inevitably generates. And the person who's raised the deepest reservations about that, I must note in all fairness and honesty, Scott Mainwaring, a specialist on Brazil, has actually renounced his earlier argument that this is a bad fit and been one of a remarkable number of American political scientists, mainly comparativists, who have endorsed PR for the United States. I want to say as well that I think we should look at the example of Australia, which is maybe a country that has more similarities to the United States culturally and historically than some European countries, and is an example of a country that is a mature democracy but has less polarization than many of the other mature democracies now. And of course, its electoral system for the lower house is ranked choice voting, with a different version of ranked choice voting for the upper house. I've asked a number of Australians, political scientists, parliamentarians, government ministers, why they've had less polarization and whether they thought that ranked choice voting was really the answer. And I've gotten a very fascinating, striking, and in part striking because of its consistency, response from them. And very consistently, they've said, well, yes, we think our system of preferential voting has reduced polarization, mitigated extremism, essentially worked the way those of us, and I count me among us, who have argued for some version of ranked choice voting expected. But they've said that we also think the other innovation we have has been at least as important as ranked choice voting or preferential voting in inducing moderation and mitigating extremism. And that, maybe counterintuitively, is compulsory voting. Good luck getting compulsory voting in the United States. So I will say also that one of the exercises we did as a complement to this, a kind of feed into this with some support from our task force, was a national deliberative poll in the United States of America in June of 2023. If you go to the site American One Room Electoral Reform, you'll find the results of the deliberative poll we did, where we put to a random sample of Americans who deliberated online a series of reforms, virtually everything that has been presented here today, to see what would fly if they got a chance to be informed about these reforms, to hear pro and con arguments, and then to talk about them with their fellow citizens in small groups. And support for ranked choice voting generally rose after deliberation from, I'd say, a modal figure, because we put it for local, state, and federal elections, and in primaries and general elections. So we had 6 options. And the modal kind of response was about 40 to 42% before deliberation and a small majority after deliberation. Not a shattering breakthrough, but an increase in support. I might say that there was a similar, maybe even slightly larger increase in support for proportional representation, but it went from a smaller initial percentage in the early 30% range to the lower 40% range at the end. I wanted to know what Americans might think about compulsory voting when we put that to them as well, and gave it our best shot, which is a lot of the arguments that the colleague of Elaine's and Bill Galston's at Brookings, E.J. Dionne, and his colleague, the former Secretary of State of Connecticut, Miles Rappaport, wrote about in their book on, they didn't call it compulsory voting, they had a better, less, universal voting, thank you, name for it. And we put all those arguments to this random sample of the American public, and before deliberation, only about 18 to 20% of the American public could go for something like that on the face of it. And after giving them all the arguments and giving them a chance to deliberate, it was about 18 to 20% of the American public that favored it after. We're a libertarian country. It's just not going to fly, right? So I think a lot of where I've come out is that I want to work for reforms that have a chance of passing, maybe not all in the next 2 to 3 years, but in a 10 to 15-year time horizon. And that's why we really didn't look at any reforms that would require a constitutional amendment, either to amend Citizens United, if you don't like that. And of course, I'd say it is fair to say that philosophically our members were probably somewhat divided on that. A lot of people have asked us, why didn't you look at the Electoral College? So independent of whatever it might or might not do for polarization, to eliminate the Electoral College, there's just zero chance of it passing. So where I've come out is a little bit of a conservative instinct, not politically left-right, but politically in terms of how much you want to tinker all at once. And I think I will just share this perspective. My view is that the perspective, which I think some Americans have in a very honest and sincere way, and a certain number of political scientists have, looking at the mess we're in now, that things could not get worse, is actually, I think, misplaced. They could get worse. And we should be, I think, a little bit experimental, incremental, test and see how we go. So some of the things that speak to me that I think are in the spirit of incrementalism, plausibility, you have heard. In terms of primary elections, I think it's plausible that we could at least consolidate more the dates of state-level primary elections, maybe, and creep up to, Rob, your view of a universal date for state primaries. In terms of campaign finance, by the way, we also included a lot of these proposals for campaign finance, virtually all of the ones you articulated. Americans do not like public funding of anything, individual candidates, political parties. They don't like political parties. They don't want more funding for political parties, but they do like transparency. And I actually think a bill that kind of led with transparency and then had the increased party financing on the back end without making a big public to-do about it, I think that's plausible. That might fly. And on the presidential primaries, I think, again, some of the incremental reforms about like pre-primary endorsements and so on. Some of these are plausible. And if we get enough accumulation of incremental helpful reforms, it might relieve some of the pressure. I'm going to now say what many of you know. For me, the big transformative reform that I think is not terribly risky, but I think could be significantly helpful through accumulation is the combination of ranked choice voting and blanket or nonpartisan primaries, top 4, top 5, I don't care. And that raises the question Elaine asked, why did they all lose this time? If you entered the 2024 election, as I did, thinking that the second most important set of decisions maybe that was going to be made after the presidential election were going to be the decisions in these 6 or 7 states on either ranked choice voting or, as in Arizona, the kind of setting up of the prospect of that, this was a blowout in a pretty dispiriting direction. And I'll say, if you're wondering what credibility I have in predicting the future, you should assume that it's pretty close to none, because I thought that several of these would win, particularly in Oregon, Colorado, and I thought that it would be repealed in Alaska. If you read the New York Times article, you probably saw that in Alaska, ranked choice voting with top 4 was saved by about a margin of 650 votes, and that it was the Native American community in Alaska that provided the margin of victory. I didn't see that coming either. But I think that if we weigh why these lost in a state-by-state kind of analysis, which I'm going to guess that Meredith Sumter and Fair Vote is going to be doing in a fairly deep analysis in the coming weeks and months, we'll find some clues that are not national level clues. My hypotheses are, for example, that we will find that when you have a polarizing national election that's sucking all the energy out of other levels of discussion, there's not a lot of room to explain a reform like ranked choice voting and really campaign for it. I think we'll find some state-level factors like how late the Colorado initiative got on the ballot. And sometimes the wording of an initiative can be very confusing to voters. These things matter. I think the advocates of ranked choice voting haven't paid enough attention to trying to get high-profile endorsers who might sway voters. So my sense is that 2 individuals turning against ranked choice voting had enormous impacts in leading to the defeat of ranked choice voting in Massachusetts a few years ago and in Colorado this year. And those were high credibility, well-liked, centrist politicians, Charlie Baker, the governor of Massachusetts, and Michael Bennet, the senator from Colorado, who would have been logical proponents of ranked choice voting who came out against it. So I think there's also other strategies. I'm told that in Nevada, the campaign kind of went dark after winning 2 years ago and thought it would be better to keep a low profile and then surface again at the end when perhaps a consistent working of the society and the electorate might have been a better approach. I want to close by saying this. I think that we have another problem in the United States that, in retrospect, I'm not sure we've focused enough attention on in terms of electoral reform and democracy, but that I think both ranked choice voting and PR in very different ways could address. And now I'm going to speak very personally about the state that I have lived in all my life. I've got 2 colleagues who have recently moved to my state. Brandis or Ben comes and visits us whenever we're fortunate enough to have him at Hoover, and so I think they'll resonate with what I'm going to say. California is a one-party state. Above all else, I'm a Democrat with a small d, and I don't believe in one-party states. I think it's really unhealthy. But we are now so culturally divided in the United States and so much resonating to symbols, memes, and brands that if you've got the R after your line on the ballot, it's the kiss of death in California. And I think we got a recent test of this that was very telling a couple years ago when I thought one of the best, most creative, most moderate Republican candidates that we've had at the statewide level, who I will confess is my colleague also at Hoover, Lanny Chen, ran for an office that if we were going to elect a Republican in the state of California, you would think that would be the ideal office, state controller, kind of managing the finances and ensuring integrity in public life. He ran the best campaign that I think a Republican could have won, and he got about the same percentage, that Republicans cap out at. And I think unless we shake up the electoral system in a way that enables alternatives to rise on the ballot who don't have the scarlet letter after their name, whether it's R in a state like California or D in a solid Republican state, we're going to see, as I think we're seeing in California, just a decline in the quality of democracy and a decline in the quality of governance and a lack of sufficient creativity in policy responses. So my bet is going to be on pushing for electoral reform, particularly at the state level. I think it's not really plausible at the national level. Now, ideally, we would have about 15 or 20 minutes of further conversation, but we're at 12:15. You've been an amazing group here, being so patient to see us through. So I think at this point, we should allow the conversation to proceed informally on the margins. And I should just end by issuing a few thank yous. First of all, I want to thank all 31 members of our task force who participated in, 2 years of dialogue, writing, arguing, negotiation. It's been a very instructive experience. Several of them you've heard from here. All 31 are listed in that document, which has a kind of executive summary of our findings. I think it's a very handy document, by the way. I hope you'll take it with you. It's a long book. This is a useful distillation. I'm not going to call it Cliff Notes, but you'll find them useful. Second of all, I want to thank Ned Foley for hosting this project in his center, Election Law at Ohio State, and his 2 project managers, Jillian Thompson and Isra Saleh, who saw us through to completion. I do believe the book, which I encourage you to get if you're willing to by buying it. If not, maybe I shouldn't say this, but we actually had a strong commitment to promoting this, so it's an open access book. If you want, you can just download it for free at lynnreiner.com. We had a great editor, Ty McCormick, who also works for Foreign Affairs, who worked on our manuscripts and really improved the writing and the coherence. I do want to thank Lynn Reiner, not only for publishing the book, I think she's a great academic publisher, but also for working with us on the open access. And finally, John, where are you? John Fortier? Yeah. Oh, there you are. Thank you for hosting us here. I mean, what an amazing facility you have. We knew that AEI was a great think tank, but now it's in a really great place. And to end where we began, what better address could you have than 1789 Massachusetts Avenue? Thank you all so much.